Sansa Stark stood at the highest balcony of the Red Keep, gazing out over the rooftops and winding streets of King's Landing. The air tasted of sea salt and dust. Beneath her, the yard bustled with busy servants and patrolling guards, though none of them looked up at her. She supposed they were used to seeing her there. The young queen-to-be of Westeros, already draped in Lannister red and gold, her auburn hair pinned and braided to perfection. Yet Sansa felt a strange disconnect, as if the scene belonged to a play she had been cast in against her will. What would father have said, she wondered, if he saw her now? A swirl of memories rose unbidden. His strong, kind face, the smell of leather and pine that always clung to him, the steady calm in his gray eyes. Lord Eddard Stark had come to the city to serve the realm, only to be betrayed and executed before the baying crowds. And now she, his eldest daughter, was to wed the very boy who had ordered his death. Joffrey Baratheon, though many whispered that he was no Baratheon at all, had chosen her for his queen, and every day she told herself that if she survived this, she could survive anything. It was a lesson she learned slowly. Each time Joffrey sneered at her, or humiliated her before the court, or threatened her with some new cruelty, she counted the stars in the sky and remembered her northern home. But she never fought back, never contradicted him. Instead, she smiled and performed the perfect courtesy, curtsying just so, batting her eyelashes like a soft southern lady. It seemed that was all she could do, until now, because the wedding was days away, and she still did not know how to feel, how to act, how to plan for what came next. Joffrey would be her husband, and that meant she would be queen. A frightened, lonely queen, but a queen nonetheless. She'd had her girlish dreams, once upon a time, of marrying a handsome prince. He was to be valiant and strong, with a heart full of love for her. They would dance in ballrooms and wander gardens, and he would gift her with rose-scented poems each morning. That dream had died the day her father died. Now all that remained was the reality. A golden-haired boy with a cruel mouth and dead eyes that sparkled only at others' pain. She drew in a breath and squared her shoulders, as her mother always told her. You must keep your back straight, your chin high, no matter the storms. She remembered that from Catelyn Stark's gentle instructions at Winterfell, where the grass had been green in the short summer, and all her brothers would run through the courtyards, their laughter filling the crisp air. Winterfell was gone to her now, a memory as unreachable as the moon. Here, in this southern capital with all its intrigues, the only way to hold on to a shred of her family's legacy was to survive, and if that meant marrying Joffrey, so be it. In the quiet space of her mind, she vowed that she would find ways to protect what remained of the North. She would shield herself, and she would shield those who still drew breath. She had to. Joffrey stood at the high table during the feast that preceded the official wedding ceremony. It was a sumptuous affair, a testament to the Lannisters' wealth and the vanity of King's Landing. The hall was lit by hundreds of torches that danced across polished walls, reflecting in the golden plates and jeweled goblets. Sansa sat on a seat just below the dais beside the Queen Regent, Cersei Lannister, whose watchful green eyes seemed to follow her every move like a cat eyeing prey. She could hear the chatter and feasting of the lords and ladies in the hall. Silver platters bore roasted duck and quail, fruits from the reach, pies stuffed with succulent meat. Across the hall, she glimpsed Tyrion Lannister, the king's uncle, quietly observing the proceedings with a cup of wine in his hand. He lifted his cup toward her in a small, almost comforting salute. Sansa managed the barest hint of a smile in return. Tyrion had been kind to her in small ways, kind in a city where kindness was scarce. Joffrey called for silence. The music stopped. In the hush, he raised a goblet brimming with wine. His voice, high and shrill, echoed in the hall. "To my beautiful bride-to-be," he said, with a grand gesture toward Sansa. She rose from her chair and bowed her head politely. "And to our union," Joffrey continued, "which will bring peace and prosperity to the realm. After the short ceremony tomorrow, she will be your queen, and the kingdoms will rejoice." A forced cheer erupted around them. The lords and ladies clapped politely, and a few in the crowd hollered words of approval for the king. Sansa plastered on her most charming, courtly smile. In the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of the hound Sandor Clegane, standing guard, a silent sentinel with burned flesh and eyes that gave away too much pain. He had once tried to offer her a way out. She had been too scared to take it. Now, with her wedding on the horizon, she wondered if it was too late for any chance at freedom. Joffrey's goblet clinked against his mother's, then against the cups of important lords, before he looked at Sansa again. "Tomorrow," he said, "you'll be mine." That last word, mine, sent a shiver through her that had little to do with excitement or romance. She sank back into her seat. "Tomorrow," she echoed softly, taking a sip of her watered wine. Around them, the hall erupted into forced merriment once more, with music and dancing. Joffrey beckoned her to his side, forcing her to stand beside him while he boasted to the visiting lords about how he'd vanquish Stannis Baratheon, how he'd crush Robb Stark in the north. She said little. She listened. She curtsied. She smiled. When the feast ended and she returned to her chambers, Sansa tried to keep her hands from trembling as her maids undid her braids. Shay, Tyrion's handmaiden, gave Sansa a sympathetic look when the other maids weren't watching. Sometimes Sansa felt like bursting into tears and clinging to the older girl for comfort, but she did not. She couldn't. She had to be strong, as her mother had said. That night she dreamt of Winterfell burning, wolves howling in the distance, and a lion's roar echoing in her ears. The wedding ceremony was grand and lavish. The great September of Baelor was adorned with flowers of every color, roses, lilies, and daisies brought in from distant provinces. 1,000 candles flickered in high chandeliers while the septons chanted ancient vows. The crowd of nobles, knights, and highborn ladies in attendance thrummed with anticipation. Sansa's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked down the aisle, flanked by 2 Kingsguard in white cloaks. Every eye in the September was upon her. She could feel their gazes like scorching sunlight. Joffrey stood at the altar, clad in crimson and gold. A crown of antlers and gold was perched on his golden curls. Beside him were Cersei and Tyrion, each in their own fine garments, each wearing an expression that told a different story. Cersei exuded triumph and subtle smugness. Tyrion watched with a mix of wariness and reluctant pity. Even from a distance, Sansa could see the tension in the dwarf's mouth, as if he hated witnessing this travesty as much as she hated living it. Yet for all that, Sansa pressed her shoulders back and lifted her chin. She might have been trembling on the inside, but she would not let them see it. She thought of her sister Arya, somewhere out there in the world, fierce and wild, refusing to bow her head to anyone. That memory steadied her. If Arya could remain defiant in the face of adversity, so would she, albeit in her own quiet way. The High Septon began the ceremony. Sansa's voice barely quavered as she repeated her vows, speaking words that she had once dreamed would fill her heart with joy. Instead, every syllable felt hollow. Joffrey took her hands in his. His skin was clammy, his grip too firm. She could feel the faint tremor in his fingers, though whether it was excitement or the thrill of control, she could not tell. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, her stomach lurched. Applause thundered in the September. White doves were released in a sweeping flutter that soared to the rafters. The music rose in a triumphant crescendo, and Sansa found it difficult to breathe. Joffrey leaned in to press a kiss on her lips, the first as husband and wife, and she closed her eyes. It was a soft kiss, yet it carried the tang of triumph she could almost taste on his mouth. After the ceremony, Sansa was swept away into the throng of courtiers, all eager to congratulate their new queen. She had to pause and remind herself that was what she was now, Queen Sansa, wife to King Joffrey Baratheon. She managed gentle thanks, graceful curtsies, and serene smiles. She endured the critical, measuring stares of noblewomen and the leering glances of lords. Many came with flattery, praising her beauty or gracious manner. Some, though, had pity in their eyes or well-disguised distaste. Their hushed comments pricked at her ears. "So young," one said. "Poor girl," whispered another. But they offered their words behind fluttering fans, anxious not to displease the new king. She was dizzied by the day's pageantry, and the wedding feast stretched on into the evening. The hall was ablaze with torches, and it seemed that every lord in the 7 kingdoms was jostling for a seat at the great tables. Musicians played lively tunes, jugglers performed, and dancers spun in circles. Lord Baelish Peter, who had once been so friendly with her mother, gave her a small nod. Varys, the master of whisperers, watched her with curious, glittering eyes. Grand Maester Pycelle simpered his congratulations in a wheezing voice. Somewhere in the midst of all these congratulators, Sansa forced her features into a mask of contentment. She accepted goblet after goblet of sweet arbor wine, though she barely sipped. When Joffrey demanded that she join him on the dais, she obeyed. He seemed in high spirits, flush with the power of the day. Smile, he commanded in her ear as she took her seat. She did. The crowd shouted blessings for the king and queen. And Sansa Stark, now Sansa Baratheon, realized she wore a crown upon her braided hair. It felt heavier than she could have ever imagined. There was a time in the north when Sansa had yearned for this exact life. Not precisely this man, though once she thought she loved him, but this existence of being a beloved royal. Now her illusions were shattered and the world had grown more dangerous. She saw it in the glint of steel, in the secret alliances, in the hush that fell whenever her husband approached. She learned to sense the currents beneath courtly words. And she quietly resolved to do more than just endure. She would carve out a little piece of safety for herself and, if the gods were good, for her family. The marriage bed was awkward and full of fear. Joffrey's impatience crackled through the air, and Sansa's stomach twisted as she tried to remain still, docile. He took pleasure in reminding her that the city saw him as a hero who defended it from Stannis, that every lord in Westeros must bow to him, and that she was his. But it was over quickly, leaving her with a hollow ache and a fierce determination not to cry. When he left her that night, after falling asleep in her bed for a brief time, she rose and lit a candle. She stared at her reflection in a small polished mirror. Her hair was tangled, her skin pallid. A bruise was forming on her arm where his hand had gripped too tightly. She pressed her fingertips to it, feeling the hurt. That physical soreness was real, but in her mind's eye she recalled her father's face, and she refused to weep. This would not break her. She whispered a prayer to the old gods, though she doubted they could hear her so far from the north. And then she climbed back into bed to sleep, for she would need her wits on the morrow. Life as queen began the next day at dawn. She was roused by her maids, led to a large bedchamber near the king's apartments, and dressed in regal finery. Cersei appeared shortly after, dismissing the servants. The queen regent, though she was now queen dowager, as Sansa was queen, sat on a cushioned chair, crossing her legs. Sansa stood, unsure whether to curtsy or remain upright. After all, the shift in power was strange and precarious. Joffrey was king. Sansa, as his wife, outranked Cersei in theory, but not in practice. Cersei's smirk told her as much. "Your Grace," Cersei said, her voice smooth as silk, "my congratulations. I trust you slept well." There was a glint in her green eyes, like she was daring Sansa to speak the truth. "I did, thank you," Sansa replied softly, offering the bare minimum courtesy. Cersei rose and paced the chamber. "You must learn quickly. A queen must navigate the demands of the realm, the pleasure of the king, and the expectations of the people. Already, the city buzzes with your name. They remark on your beauty, your innocence, your northern heritage. They'll want you to produce an heir soon." At the mention of an heir, Sansa felt heat creep into her cheeks. She nodded. "I understand," she managed. Cersei continued, "As queen, you'll be expected to hold court, settle small disputes, attend to charitable duties, and host gatherings. But most important, you must support your husband's rule. Any sign of disloyalty." Sansa caught the threat. She lowered her eyes as if cowed. "I would never," she murmured, though her mind rebelled at the idea that she would ever truly support Joffrey's cruelty. "Good," Cersei said, her tone clipped. "You'll do as you're told and everything will go smoothly. Don't let anyone fool you. This is a nest of vipers, and the second they smell weakness, they will strike. If you want to keep that pretty head on your shoulders, dear daughter, you will do well to remember that." It felt strange to hear Cersei call her daughter, but Sansa nodded. It was all she could do. Cersei left soon after, the train of her gown sweeping across the chamber floor. Sansa stood in the silence, her skirts heavy, her mind spinning. She clenched her hands, telling herself again and again, survive. Courtiers came to pay respects to the new queen. She saw eager lords from the Westerlands, sly-eyed merchants, ladies from the Reach who fluttered their eyelashes at her. Some tried to curry favor, presenting her with lavish gifts or compliments. A few spoke openly of their contempt for the Starks, but under a veneer of civility. Sansa listened, forced to smile. She gleaned tidbits of information from their babble, where armies were gathering, who was struggling financially, which houses quarreled. She had no immediate use for such knowledge, but she remembered her father's lessons about the importance of listening. So she let them talk, storing their words like seeds she might one day plant. She dined with Joffrey each evening. Sometimes, to her relief, they dined in public with half the court in attendance. Other times it was a small, private supper where Joffrey demanded her undivided attention. He often boasted of hunts he planned or battles he dreamed of waging. She would nod, ask polite questions, feign admiration. He seemed to like it when she admired his sword, his skill with the crossbow, anything that fed his vanity. In those moments, he would grin, that cruel edge in his eyes receding just enough that she could breathe a little more freely. Yet Sansa knew better than to trust these brief respites. One evening, as she tried to nibble her meal, Joffrey broke into a tirade about the Starks, mocking Robb as a treacherous wolf. He glanced at her as if daring her to disagree. She let the insult hang in the air, forced a small smile, and murmured something about the war being costly for the realm. Perhaps that was too bold, her heart thundered in her chest. But he only shrugged and said, "The North will yield, or I'll make them yield." After supper, he insisted on her company in his private solar. She stood by the window while he toyed with a new crossbow, describing how he meant to use it on his enemies. He smirked and aimed it at the door as if seeing an imaginary foe. The sight of him handling that weapon, those hands that had once commanded the executioner to swing the sword on her father, made her lightheaded. Still, she smiled. Still, she endured. Deep in the night, she lay awake and remembered the gentle snows of Winterfell, the great hall filled with warmth and hearty laughter, the sense of safety she had once taken for granted. She vowed that if a chance came to protect her family or even a single innocent, she would seize it. As the weeks rolled on, King's Landing simmered with tension. Robb Stark was still a threat in the north, and rumors said Stannis Baratheon gathered new allies. Meanwhile, Joffrey reveled in his newfound status as a husband. He commanded feasts, hunts, and small tournaments to celebrate his marriage. The city was exhausted by war and unrest, but he demanded splendor nonetheless. At one tournament, Sansa sat in the royal box while knights jousted below. Dust billowed in the sunlight, the crowd roaring with each lance that shattered. Joffrey lounged beside her wearing an expression of boredom unless a rider took a particularly nasty fall which would make him lean forward with glee. She tried not to flinch. Instead, she cheered politely, clapping in the right places, her face schooled into pleased neutrality. Between matches, a messenger approached the royal box. Joffrey listened, then his face twisted into a scowl. "Another letter from my beloved uncle, Stannis," he said, spitting the words with derision. "He claims I am no rightful king." Sansa's stomach clenched, but she only blinked. "What will you do?" He glared at her as if suspecting a trap. Then he relaxed into a sneer. "Laugh in his face, of course. He calls himself the rightful heir, but so long as the Iron Throne is mine, that traitor's words mean nothing. I have the city, I have the throne, and I have you, my lady wife." His voice turned suggestive, as if mocking her. She swallowed, bowed her head. A new set of knights thundered onto the field. One wore a shield with a snarling dog. The Hound, perhaps, or some lesser knight trying to flatter the Cleganes. Sansa watched the joust with half her attention. Her mind drifted to the endless possibilities of the war. She wondered if perhaps her brother Robb would triumph. And if he did, what then? When a knight was unhorsed with a brutal crash, the crowd erupted in cheers or gasps. Joffrey laughed aloud, clapping his hands. Sansa forced a demure smile, but her heart sank. She had to find some measure of control in this new life. She found that measure in small gestures at first. Offering words of comfort to the poor when she handed out bread at the Great September, inquiring after the health of orphans left behind by the war. At first, Joffrey allowed it, perhaps believing it made for good optics. A generous young queen who cared for her people. The small folk were suspicious at first, but soon, when Sansa began distributing food and coin in small but meaningful ways, she found them looking upon her with something like gratitude. She saw it in their eyes, in the murmured blessings they offered. "She's a Stark," some said. "They're closer to the old ways, less cruel." Or so she heard whispered among the crowds. Part of her found comfort in that. She might be trapped in the lion's den, but there was still something of the wolf in her. Of course, not everyone was pleased by her gestures. Cersei confronted her in the gardens one afternoon, roses and lilies providing a fragrant backdrop. "You do not want to spoil the small folk, dear," the Queen Dowager said, Voic. "Eclipsed. They're like children, give them a taste and they'll demand far more. And if you cannot provide it, they'll turn into a mob." Sansa bowed her head. "I only wish to fulfill my role as queen, to show that the crown cares for them. It might keep them loyal." Cersei narrowed her eyes. "I see. You've grown clever, haven't you?" A small, bitter laugh escaped her. "Just remember, your first duty is to the king. If ever he disapproves of your little charities, you will cease them immediately. Sansa swallowed. Of course. For all that, she didn't cease. She simply made sure to keep her efforts discreet, focusing on subtle acts of kindness that the king would not notice. A coin slip to a servant's sick relative, a short visit to the orphanage with a hamper of food. It was a risk, but she felt she owed it to the people. If she was to be queen, she could not let her husband's cruelty define her entire reign. That small defiance gave her strength. Time passed in a haze of court ceremonies, public appearances, and private battles behind closed doors. Some nights Joffrey came to her chamber in a foul mood, complaining of the lords pressing him for lower taxes or the Tyrells overshadowing him with their wealth, or of rumors that Robb Stark had seized another Lannister stronghold. Then he would take out his frustration on her, sometimes with harsh words, other times grabbing her wrists too tightly. Her bruises accumulated, but she learned to hide them with long sleeves or clever arrangement of jewelry. In the daylight hours, she schooled her face into a serene mask. Even when Margaery Tyrell arrived at court, Margaery, who had once been betrothed to Joffrey, who was rumored to have her own designs, Sansa held her composure. Margaery was gracious to her, offering smiles and praise for her new status as queen. Sansa tried to reciprocate, though deep inside she felt a flare of jealousy that Margaery was so beloved by the city. Yet the jealousy was tempered by relief that she herself no longer bore the brunt of envy from others. She was no longer the naive girl who dreamed of being the most beloved maiden in the realm. She was a wife to a dangerous king, struggling to keep her head above water. And so the court spun on day after day as alliances formed and shifted. Varys visited her on occasion with polite inquiries. How does your grace find the city? Are you adapting well to your duties? She answered with gentle civility. But she sensed in the eunuch's dark eyes that he probed her for secrets, testing the shape of her mind. She gave away nothing. Peter Baelish, too, would approach her with soft, insinuating words. If ever you tire of the cage, my dear, I can help you. Your mother was like family to me. But she mistrusted him. He exuded cunning and opportunism. He might have helped her escape once, but now that she was queen, his ambitions might well lead to her ruin. Only Tyrion, the imp, seemed to offer genuine conversation without barbed hooks. He would sometimes find her in the library or in the garden, bow slightly, and say, Your Grace, I hope you are well, with an undertone of sympathy. She never admitted her struggles, but she suspected he knew. Perhaps more than anyone, Tyrion understood what it was like to be a Lannister in name but an outsider in reality, forced to navigate a family where cruelty often trumped compassion. One day, Tyrion found her pacing a secluded courtyard. She was practicing a walk of regal bearing, head high, shoulders back, and she paused when she saw him. My lord. He dipped his head. Your grace. You found a quiet spot. She cast a glance around. The keep can be quite stifling. I find I breathe easier out in the open air. I understand the sentiment. He looked up at her with frankness. I know we have not always been allies, lady, your grace. But if you ever need counsel, I will give it freely. She studied him, weighing his offer. Why would you do that? She asked, her voice cautious. A crooked smile tugged at his mouth. Because I have no love for my nephew's cruelty and I've seen enough suffering to last a lifetime. I would rather see the realm governed by someone with a shred of decency. Sansa felt a spark of gratitude, but she kept her tone measured. Thank you, she said softly. I might take you up on that. He nodded and did not press further. That was the nature of their understanding. No open rebellion, just a quiet offer of empathy between two people trapped by the power of House Lannister. Amid these shifting alliances, Sansa grew stronger. Her mask of courtesy became a weapon. She observed how Cersei maneuvered with the council, how she manipulated the lords by playing on their desires. Sansa tried to glean from Margaery how charm could be used to defuse conflict. She watched Tyrion's subtlety in steering conversations away from dangerous territory. All the while, she learned to read Joffrey's moods, to flatter him when it was safest, and to stand her ground in small, silent ways when she had to protect someone else. Her greatest test arrived when the city's food stores ran low. A poor harvest in the Reach, combined with the devastation of war, meant that King's Landing faced shortages. The small folk grew hungry, restless. Murmurs of discontent rippled through the streets. Joffrey responded by increasing the Gold Cloak's patrols, punishing any who dared to complain too loudly. Sansa, however, pleaded for more prudent measures. One evening at supper, surrounded by the small council, she spoke up, Your Grace, the people grow desperate. If we do not provide enough bread and fresh water, they may riot. We should consider distributing extra supplies from the royal granaries. Joffrey slammed his goblet down. You would have me coddle them? He snarled. They are my subjects. They owe me their loyalty. If they starve, Perhaps they should learn not to anger the king with their whining. Her heart hammered, but she forced a calm voice. Hunger breeds chaos, my king, and chaos can lead to rebellion. The cost of feeding them might be less than the cost of quelling a revolt. Tywin Lannister, the king's grandfather, raised an eyebrow at Sansa's boldness. But instead of chiding her, he spoke coolly. She has a point. Historically, the smallest spark can set a city ablaze. Providing minimal grain might be wise. Joffrey shot Tywin a glare, but he grudgingly acquiesced. Fine, a little grain. Then he directed his cold eyes at Sansa. But do not think this gives you license to meddle in matters of state. You're my queen, not my hand. She inclined her head. Yes, your grace. Inside, relief flooded her. She had won a small victory, one that might keep the people from rioting, and perhaps keep Joffrey's wrath at bay. Later that night, Joffrey seethed in her chambers, calling her an insolent girl who dared to lecture him in front of his council. His mood was dangerous. He gripped her chin in a painful hold and hissed, "You belong to me. Do you understand that?" She bit back tears and nodded, letting the silence speak. He released her, shoved her onto the bed, and stormed out. Sansa lay there, trembling. But despite the ache in her jaw, she felt a small stirring of triumph. She had done something to help the hungry. A single act of compassion. Could that be the start of a better legacy? She closed her eyes and whispered prayers that the old gods might protect her. Winter's chill arrived belatedly in the south. A mild winter that dusted King's Landing with only the lightest frost in the mornings. Yet the mild winter did little to ease the tension in the city. Each day, new rumors emerged, Robb Stark winning a battle in the west, Stannis forging alliances in Essos, or Daenerys Targaryen raising dragons in the Far East. Joffrey mocked each threat, but his council kept urging caution. Sansa's days were measured by her duties. She visited the orphans, presided over charitable distributions, under the watchful eye of Cersei or a Kingsguard, and occasionally joined Joffrey for state functions. Each day was a performance, and each night she prayed she'd see the morning. In that crucible, however, she felt a sense of clarity. She realized that if the realm was to endure, if there was any hope for a kinder future, she might have to do more than endure Joffrey's outrages. She might have to influence him, guide him, or even oppose him when he threatened to tear the realm apart. Once, Joffrey commanded that she accompany him to witness an execution. A butcher's son had spat at a gold cloak, incensed by the shortage of bread. Joffrey ordered the boy's tongue cut out, then beheaded him for good measure. Sansa could not stop trembling as she watched the sword descend, but she kept her face a mask. She felt the eyes of the crowd upon her, saw a mixture of pity and hatred. They hated the king and by extension, her. In that moment, she realized that no matter how many small kindnesses she performed, it might never wash away the blood Joffrey spilled. That night, she could not sleep. She wandered to the window and watched the moonlit city. A tear slipped down her cheek as she thought of the butcher's boy. Not Micah from years ago, but another boy who had lost his life for nothing. Sansa recalled Micah's terrified face in the Riverlands, how Joffrey had tormented him. That cruelty had never truly abated. It only changed shape, found new victims. She exhaled a shaky breath and pressed her palms to the cold stone window sill. "I won't let him do this forever," she whispered into the darkness, unsure how she could ever make a difference. Still, the oath burned in her heart. Days slipped into months. Joffrey's war campaigns continued, though he stayed comfortably in the capital, letting his generals and other Lannisters handle the real fighting. Robb Stark, the young wolf, had some victories and some losses, and the tides of war felt unpredictable. Sansa clung to any shred of news about the North, about her mother, her brother, Winterfell. She learned that her mother was gone, murdered at the Red Wedding, along with Robb. The news shattered something inside her. For days, she was numb, drifting through court like a ghost. When the king told her, with sadistic glee, about the Red Wedding, about how her mother's body was thrown in the river, Sansa's knees nearly gave out. She had to leave the feast, claiming illness, to avoid collapsing under the weight of her grief. She wept alone in her chamber that night, no longer able to hold back tears. No one offered comfort except Tyrion, who found her the next day and murmured condolences. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering a handkerchief. She managed to nod her thanks. The rest of the court feigned politeness or ignored her sorrow. Cersei said, "It's a war, dear. People die. You must be stronger than this." Sansa found a cold rage building beneath her sorrow. Her father was gone. Her mother was gone. Robb was gone. Bran and Rickon rumored dead, and Arya's fate unknown. She was the last Stark in King's Landing, forced to bear the name Baratheon. But in her heart, she was still a Stark, and she would never forget what House Lannister had done. She fell into a deep quiet for a time. She moved through the motions of her queenly duties, mechanically. Joffrey took little note. He was too busy gloating over the war's successes. He would speak of new taxes, new punishments, and she would simply nod and smile. But in the recesses of her mind, she was planning. Not an open rebellion, she had no power for that, but a quiet form of defiance that might one day save her or others from further brutality. Fate gave her a spark of opportunity when news reached King's Landing that Stannis Baratheon had set sail from Dragonstone with a fresh host. The Iron Throne's hold was not as secure as Joffrey boasted, and more unrest festered in the city. Faced with external threats, the king's advisors scrambled to shore up defenses. Walls were strengthened, new alliances sought. Even Joffrey seemed shaken, perhaps remembering how close Stannis had come during the Battle of the Blackwater. As the city braced for siege, Sansa found herself among the common folk more often, distributing supplies and offering encouragement. She tried to quell panic, reminding them that the city's defenses had held once before. She loathed lying to them, but at least she could offer some measure of reassurance. In that process, she gained a flicker of loyalty from the small folk who saw her as their advocate, however powerless she might truly be. One day, as she oversaw the distribution of bread near the mud gate, a ragged woman clutched at Sansa's gown. "My queen," the woman sobbed. "My children are hungry. We've eaten rats. The gold cloaks chase us away from the gates. Please." Sansa beckoned for the servants to give more bread to the woman. "I'm sorry," she whispered, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Do what you can to stay safe." The woman kissed Sansa's hand, tears streaming down her face. Sansa's own eyes welled up, but she held them back. She realized, with painful clarity, that these people looked to her for salvation she could barely provide. Evening found her back in the Red Keep, returning to her chambers when she encountered Joffrey in the corridor. He was in a black mood, scowling and cursing the cowardly lords who wouldn't muster their full forces for him. He saw Sansa's dirty skirts, speckled with mud from the city's streets, and sneered. "Crawling in the filth with the rats again?" She bowed her head. "If I can help quell their fears, it might keep them loyal." He seized her by the wrist, his grip bruising. "You think I can't hold the city by force? I can make them loyal with the edge of a sword." Sansa winced. "I meant no disrespect, my king. I only want to support you." He flung her hand aside. "See that you do. Now clean yourself. I won't have my queen looking like a beggar." He strode off in a swirl of crimson robes. She clutched her wrist, swallowing her anger. The city's tension mounted. Joffrey's hatred of Stannis burned ever hotter. When Stannis's fleet was sighted off the coast, the Red Keep braced for war once more. But fate took another twist. A sudden storm in the narrow sea scattered Stannis's ships, crippling his assault before it began. The city let out a collective sigh of relief. Joffrey, emboldened again, boasted about his unstoppable might. Sansa found herself returning to the cycle of forced smiles and calculated silences. But a fragile shift had taken place. Many in the city had seen the king's cruelty and the queen's small acts of mercy. Whispers circulated that if it came to a choice between them, they'd side with her. Sansa knew whispers meant little in a world ruled by swords. Yet she filed that knowledge away, uncertain if the time would come when it might save her. More months rolled by. From the vantage of the royal balcony, Sansa watched the city's changing seasons. She watched the throngs that crowded the streets below, the ships that arrived bearing goods or soldiers, the horizon that stretched far beyond King's Landing toward a north she might never see again. And slowly, she felt the chain of her marriage to Joffrey morph from raw pain into a bitter, resolute acceptance. This was her life, but she would not let it define her entirely. Every so often, she found small ways to thwart Joffrey's cruelty. She discovered that if she diverted certain messages or fabricated small reports, she could sometimes spare an unlucky merchant from the king's wrath or delay a harsh punishment. She exploited the fact that Joffrey rarely bothered with details. He liked grand gestures, not the minutiae of governance. With the help of a few sympathetic clerks, or by dropping a carefully placed hint in Tywin's ear, Sansa managed to reduce certain taxes to keep coin flowing to the orphanages. She dared not do anything too dramatic lest Joffrey notice and lash out. But in these hidden maneuvers, she felt the quiet power of a queen's influence. Tyrion, who guessed some of her discreet endeavors, offered her a small nod of approval one night. "Careful, your grace," he murmured at a court feast. "If you're too clever, you might change the world." She gave him a faint smile. The world could use some changing. "Indeed," Tyrion said, raising his goblet. Still, the threat of exposure loomed. She lived in fear that one day Joffrey would realize how she eased the burden on the small folk, or how she corresponded with a handful of northern lords who remained loyal to the name Stark. She received coded letters from them, never anything explicit that would raise suspicion, but enough to let her know that pockets of resistance remained. She never replied directly, not wanting to endanger them or herself. But sometimes she found herself softly repeating the words the North remembers, as if they were a mantra that kept her heart beating. In the third year of her marriage, an unexpected tragedy struck the royal family. Margaery Tyrell, who had stayed in the capital to support her family's alliance with the Lannisters, fell gravely ill. The fever spread among several highborn ladies, and within a fortnight, Margaery passed away. The city mourned. Even those who had harbored jealousy toward her charm and power felt sorrow at her untimely demise. Joffrey shrugged it off, showing little grief, more concerned with whether the Tyrells would remain loyal. But Sansa privately wept. Margaery had been a friend of sorts, someone who offered her counsel in surviving court life. With her gone, the Red Keep felt emptier, darker. Amid that gloom, new rumors arose that the Tyrell alliance might fracture, that the Reach might turn against King's Landing. Tywin Lannister scrambled to cement treaties. Joffrey raged about ungrateful traitors. Sansa, sensing a shift in the wind, tried to maintain what fragile peace remained. She discreetly wrote to Lady Olenna Tyrell, offering condolences, though carefully worded so as not to anger Joffrey if he found out. In reply, she received a short missive expressing guarded appreciation. She took heart that not everyone in the city was a monster. All the while, the war beyond the capital ebbed and flowed. Victories in the south, defeats in the west, rebellions in the Riverlands. The realm had become a patchwork of ravaged lands and weary soldiers. Sansa heard that the Vale remained largely untouched, hoarding its strength behind the Bloody Gate. She remembered that her Aunt Lisa ruled there, although rumors said she'd grown paranoid and reclusive. Another door closed for Sansa's hopes. She thought often of escape, of slipping out of the city in disguise. But she knew the risk. If she were caught, Joffrey would punish her and any who aided her. Even if she succeeded, where would she go? The North was lost to her, the Riverlands a war-torn wasteland. The Vale was closed. The Tyrells had enough problems of their own. She had no illusions that she would be safe anywhere, recognized as the king's runaway wife. So she endured. Yet she never stopped dreaming that one day the tyranny of Joffrey Baratheon might crumble. The years continued to roll. Sansa learned how to stand behind the king without letting him cast her entirely in shadow. She learned to moderate the ire of powerful lords at court, how to calm Joffrey's tantrums with flattery, how to step in quietly to lessen a punishment before it ended in someone's death. She grew tall and graceful, losing the round face of her childhood. Her eyes held a solemn intelligence, and her voice, when she chose to use it, carried surprising force. The smallfolk spoke of her in hushed tones. Queen Sansa, the Wolf Queen, they called her, some with hope, others with cynicism. Joffrey remained cruel, but he discovered that ruling a kingdom was not as simple as brandishing power. He faced rebellions, intrigues, and defeats that forced him to rely on the counsel of others. Tywin often overshadowed him. This grated on Joffrey's pride. At times, he would lash out just to prove he was the true king. But the more he struggled, the more cracks appeared in the foundation of his reign. Sansa seized these moments to strengthen her own position. She built relationships with ladies of the court who sympathized with her or admired her. She listened to the concerns of minor lords, forging silent alliances. She gleaned secrets from overheard conversations in the corridors. The knowledge became her armor. If Joffrey confronted her about rumors, she would feign ignorance, batting her eyelashes as she had in her youth. Cersei, for her part, grew more reclusive after losing influence to Tywin and after seeing how Sansa had cultivated a measure of popularity. She still threatened Sansa, but the words rang hollow as the Queen Dowager's power waned. Tyrion had his own challenges, eventually being sent away to handle matters in the Westerlands. Sansa missed his subtle kindness, but she carried on. In the solitude of her personal sitting room, she pored over maps of the North, reading old histories of House Stark, steeling herself with the knowledge of what her family once was. A time came when the realm trembled under a new threat. Word arrived that Daenerys Targaryen had indeed returned to Westeros, her dragons grown to a fearsome size. She had allied with forces from Essos and local lords disillusioned with the Lannisters. The rumor spread through King's Landing like wildfire. The Dragon Queen was coming. Joffrey's reaction was predictable. He raged, belittling her as just a girl with a few lizards. But soon reports confirmed that entire armies were flocking to her banner. Panic settled in the capital. Refugees from the Crownlands streamed into the city. The gates were closed, and Joffrey boasted he would set the city ablaze rather than let the Targaryen usurper take it. Sansa felt dread coil within her. She thought of thousands of innocent people trapped behind the walls with a cruel boy who would do anything to preserve his throne. Desperate meetings of the small council convened at all hours, deciding how to face the Dragon Queen. Tywin urged negotiation or at least strategic compromise, but Joffrey refused to hear it. "I am the king," he shouted, spittle flying. "No one else. If she dares challenge me, I'll feed her dragons the flesh of her own men." Sansa stood quietly at the margins of these gatherings. She heard how the lords spoke in hushed tones of the Targaryen might. She knew this was no idle threat. Even as a child, she had heard tales of dragons and how they had forged the Seven Kingdoms. A part of her felt torn. If Daenerys was truly a liberator, would she free Sansa from Joffrey's cruelty? Or would she bring her own brand of destruction? In the nights that followed, Sansa barely slept. She wandered the balconies, watching the flicker of torches in the city, hearing the distant cries of fearful citizens. She prayed the city might be spared a brutal siege, but Joffrey's stubborn pride made that difficult. If he decided to unleash wildfire or some other horror, thousands would die. In the midst of that crisis, Sansa found a strange window of possibility. With tensions high, Joffrey was consumed by war councils and the terror that the Dragon Queen brought. He neglected to monitor her every movement. She was, in some ways, freer than ever, able to move about the keep, to speak with whomever she liked, as the king's men were busy with more pressing matters. She used this opening to meet with certain officials who might help reduce suffering if war broke out. She coordinated with the steward of the royal granaries to ensure, quietly, that some supplies were set aside for the small folk who might be caught in a siege. She advised the city watch to establish safe havens for orphans. She knew if Joffrey discovered her efforts, he would be furious. But he was so distracted by his own paranoia that he hardly noticed. One night, she visited the stables under the pretense of inspecting the king's horses. In a hidden corner, she found Sandor Clegane, the hound, silently grooming one of the beasts. He turned when she approached, scarred face twisting into a scowl. "What do you want, little bird?" She bristled. "Don't call me that. I'm no little bird anymore." He shrugged, setting the brush aside. "You'll always be a bird in a cage, wearing a pretty collar." Her heart hammered. She remembered how once he had offered to spirit her away from King's Landing. She had refused out of fear. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "You hate this city." "True enough," he said, leaning against a wooden post. "But leaving ain't so easy. I've seen you, Queen Sansa. You've grown braver, or at least better, at hiding your fear." She looked away. "I do what I must. Soon, the city might burn when Daenerys arrives." He spat on the ground. "Another war. Another death. Doesn't matter to me." She studied him, seeing the pain he masked with cynicism. "If the city falls, there will be chaos. You don't have to stay." He barked a laugh. "Nor do you." She swallowed. She stopped. Even now, the prospect of flight terrified her. She had no guarantee of safety outside these walls. Yet she could not deny the truth. She was a prisoner. The real question was whether she could stomach waiting here for the worst to happen. The hound gave a slow nod as if reading her thoughts. Time's running out, girl. If you're going to fly, best do it soon. Then he returned to brushing the horse, dismissing her with a flick of the wrist. Sansa walked away, her heart pounding. Could she do it? Could she flee before Daenerys arrived, before Joffrey destroyed the city he claimed to rule? Conflicting thoughts warred in her mind. On one hand, she burned with desire for freedom, for vengeance on the Lannisters who had torn her family apart. On the other, she feared the unknown, and she felt guilt at the thought of abandoning the small folk who depended on her. Some might call that foolish. After all, they owed her no loyalty, she was forced upon them. Yet she had done her best to aid them, and in a way, they were her people now. When she confided her dilemma to Tyrion, who had recently returned from the Westerlands, he pursed his lips. In an enviable position, he remarked, "But I cannot advise you, Sansa. My sister's cruelty is boundless and Joffrey's is worse. If you stay, you risk your life for uncertain returns. If you go, you risk your life outside these walls with fewer allies. Is there no middle path?" she asked quietly. Sometimes, Tyrion replied, "The only path is through the flames." She took no comfort from that answer, but it lingered in her thoughts as the threat of Daenerys loomed. Whispers said the Dragon Queen had seized castles in the Stormlands, that her dragons were terrifying to behold. Refugees told tales of black wings blotting out the sun. The Red Keep was a hive of fear and desperation. In the end, the choice was forced upon her. One fateful dawn, the bells of King's Landing tolled an alarm. Daenerys's host was approaching from the south, a cloud of dust on the horizon. Joffrey, roused from sleep, ordered the gates closed and archers to the battlements. The city braced for war, fear pulsing through every street. The gold cloaks struggled to maintain order as small folk hid in cellars or prayed in septs. Sansa donned her crown, her heart hammering. She joined Joffrey in the throne room, surrounded by the king's guard. Tywin was there, grim-faced. The tension was palpable. Joffrey railed against the traitors, cursing them for letting Daenerys march so far unopposed. A messenger rushed in. "Your Grace, the Dragon Queen demands your surrender. She waits beyond the city walls with 3 dragons overhead." Joffrey's face turned purple with rage. "I'll kill her myself." Sansa felt ice in her veins. She pictured the devastation of dragonfire, the city's walls melting, people screaming. She had to do something. She took a step forward, ignoring the thunder of her own pulse. "Your Grace," she said softly, "perhaps we should hear her terms." He rounded on her. "You would have me kneel to that usurper?" Spit flew from his lips. "You traitorous bitch. You Starks are all the same." Tywin's eyes flashed, but he held his tongue. The courtiers shifted uncomfortably. Sansa could feel the eyes of 100 men upon her. If she pressed Joffrey too hard, she might be executed on the spot. But if she did nothing, thousands would perish. She steeled herself. "If we refuse to parley, she may unleash her dragons," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "The city will burn." For a moment, she thought he might strike her. His hand twitched near his sword. But Tywin interjected in a steely voice, "She's right, Your Grace. We should at least negotiate. If you truly mean to keep your throne, you must show that you can be merciful or cunning when needed." Joffrey glowered, fists clenched. Then, with a furious exhale, he nodded. "Fine. We'll parley. But I will never surrender." The parley was arranged at the city gates. Sansa accompanied Joffrey and Tywin along with a squad of gold cloaks. From the battlements, thousands of archers watched, ready to rain arrows on Daenerys' army at the first sign of trouble. Sansa stood behind Joffrey's litter, her stomach in knots. Over the walls, she could see the gathered ranks of the Targaryen host, unsullied warriors in neat lines, Dothraki riders with braids swinging, and Westerosi knights in new banners of black and red. And circling overhead, 3 dragons, their shadows passing over the city's walls. Daenerys Targaryen herself emerged. She was slender, clad in black leather with red accents, her silvery hair blowing in the wind. Her face bore a regal calm, though her eyes burned with fierce purpose. Sansa felt a strange jolt of empathy for this woman who had also lost much, exiled, her family slaughtered, forced to fight for her birthright. Joffrey dismounted, striding forward with a sneer. Tywin stayed a step behind, face impassive. Sansa followed, trying to keep her composure. A hush fell. Every soldier, every onlooker seemed to hold their breath. Daenerys' voice rang out. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, rightful queen of the 7 kingdoms." Her gaze swept over Joffrey, Tywin, then paused on Sansa. "I come to claim what was taken from my family and to end the tyranny of false kings." Joffrey let out a sharp laugh. "Tyranny? I am the chosen king of Westeros. Your father was mad, your brother's vile. You have no claim here." His hand hovered near his sword, though it was clear he was no match for the dragons overhead. Daenerys's face hardened. There will be no more talk of that. Surrender the city or I will unleash my dragons. You have 1 day to decide. Tywin's voice was low. What terms do you offer, your grace? Daenerys arched a brow. I will spare the innocent if the city opens its gates. Joffrey Baratheon and Cersei Lannister must stand trial for their crimes. As for you, Lord Tywin, you may face your own reckoning. But the small folk need not suffer if you surrender. Joffrey spat, never. I'll see you burn before I kneel. A roar echoed from above and the largest dragon swooped lower, stirring up dust. The gold cloak stirred nervously. Joffrey flinched, but covered it by snarling. Daenerys gave him a cold smile. 1 day, she repeated. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, her retinue following. The parley ended in a tense silence. Sansa felt a wave of dread. She could see that Joffrey would never yield, and that meant the city might be bathed in dragon fire. Yet she also saw the fear in the eyes of the gold cloaks. They knew they were outmatched. Already, some might be plotting desertion. Back inside the Red Keep, Joffrey exploded in fury. He raged at Tywin for daring to entertain the notion of parley. He threatened to hang any lord who spoke of surrender. Soldiers were ordered to prepare for a final bloody defense. Wildfire barrels were readied at key points in the city. Fear spread through the keep like a plague. That evening, Sansa hid in her chamber, her mind racing. If the city fought, thousands would die, including possibly herself. She pictured the small folk, the children in the orphanages, the families who had come to see her as a source of hope. She could not let them die without trying to save them. 1 day, she had a single day. On a scrap of parchment, she scribbled a short note to one of her northern contacts who had joined Daenerys. She used the old coded phrases that had been agreed upon. Then she summoned a loyal servant, an older man who had served House Stark before. She pressed the letter into his hands, instructing him to slip out of the city by the old tunnels if possible. Deliver this to the Targaryen camp. By dawn. His eyes flicked to the writing, then back to her. Your Grace, this is dangerous. She managed a tight nod. I know, but it's our only hope. Quickly, now. He bowed and slipped away. Sansa exhaled. The final die was cast. She spent a sleepless night, hearing the clamor of soldiers mustering in the streets. In the small hours before sunrise, a pale hush fell over the city. She stood at her window and prayed to the old gods, the new gods, any gods who would listen. If Daenerys received her message, if she believed Sansa's pleas, then perhaps the city could be spared a fiery doom. At dawn, horns sounded. The Targaryen forces were on the move. Joffrey had the battlements manned, archers knocking arrows, catapults aimed. Sansa dressed in a plain gown, abandoning her crown. She hurried to a vantage point near the gatehouse. There, with the help of a trembling steward, she raised a white banner from the ramparts. The gold cloaks near her stared, uncertain what to do without a direct command from the king. Below, the Targaryen host advanced cautiously. Sansa held her breath. Please let her see this as a signal. Let her understand. A shrill shout rang out from the walls. Traitors! Came the cry of some Lannister officer. In a heartbeat, the man aimed a bow at Sansa. Her heart lurched, but before he could loose the arrow, a gold cloak knocked him aside, disarming him. The guards wavered, confused. Some muttered that they didn't want to burn. Others said they must obey the king. The tension was suffocating. Suddenly, a roar shook the sky. One of Daenerys's dragons flew overhead, its silhouette vast and dark. A wave of panic rippled through the defenders, and many dropped their weapons. Down below, the Targaryen army halted, ranks bristling. Sansa stood firm, clutching the edge of the parapet. She could feel her whole body trembling. To her relief, the dragon did not unleash fire. Instead, it circled as though waiting. Then, on a small rise outside the city walls, Sansa saw Daenerys on horseback. Next to her, a bannerman waved a white sigil. A hush fell over the defenders. A moment later, the portcullis began to lift. Some of the gold cloaks, presumably at the king's direct command, tried to stop it, but others overpowered them. Sansa glimpsed a surge of men from the city watch, some yelling that they refused to die for Joffrey's madness. The gates creaked open. In that fraught moment, Sansa realized the city was surrendering, at least partially, against Joffrey's will. She heard the king's shrill curses echoing from somewhere deeper in the castle. He was likely raging that his men had betrayed him. But the people refused to be slaughtered for his pride. Daenerys's forces poured through the gates, cautious yet determined. The gold cloaks who wanted to resist were quickly disarmed or fled. Sansa's heart pounded as she watched the Targaryen banners unfurl in the streets of King's Landing. The wave of bloodshed she had feared did not materialize. Most of the city was too weary to fight. They wanted peace, or at least a new ruler who might be better than the monster they had. A surge of relief overwhelmed her. Tears sprang to her eyes. She had risked everything, and it seemed, at least for now, the city was spared a final bloodbath. She descended the stairs from the ramparts, weaving through the chaos of soldiers. She had only one task left: to face Joffrey and ensure that he could not harm anyone else. She found him in the throne room, ranting and cursing at a handful of remaining guards who did not seem eager to die for him. He clung to the Iron Throne, red-faced and frothing about traitors. "I am your king," he shrieked. "Fight for me. Fight, or I'll have your heads." But the guards backed away, weapons lowered. Sansa entered, breathless, mud staining her skirts. Joffrey rounded on her. "You," he screeched. "You did this." She stood at the threshold, trembling but resolute. "You brought this on yourself." Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the hushed hall. "You could have spared the city months ago. But you chose cruelty again and again." He rushed at her, sword in hand. She braced herself for the strike. But the guards caught him, holding him back. He struggled, spitting curses. "Let me go. I'll kill her." They did not let him go. The heavy doors swung open and unsullied soldiers marched in, forming ranks. Behind them stepped Daenerys Targaryen, regal as she swept across the stone floor. Her dragon's roars echoed outside, ensuring no one mistook who commanded here. Joffrey sagged in the grip of the guards, eyes wild. Tywin Lannister was not present, likely detained or in hiding. Sansa swallowed, stepping aside as Daenerys approached the throne. The Targaryen queen surveyed the battered, furious king, then shifted her gaze to Sansa. Something in Daenerys's expression softened, as if she understood the torment that had led to this moment. The hall was silent but for Joffrey's labored breathing. Finally, Daenerys spoke, her tone firm. "Joffrey Baratheon, your reign is over. You will answer for your crimes." She turned to Sansa as though inviting her to speak. Sansa found her voice. He murdered my father, my mother, countless others. The realm has suffered under his cruelty." Then she drew in a shaking breath. "You said you would grant mercy to the innocent. There are many in this city who deserve it. But he does not." Joffrey hurled insults, struggling against his captors. "Traitor. Treacherous bitch. You'll all die." Daenerys's face was impassive. "Take him away," she ordered the Unsullied. They dragged him from the hall, his screams echoing off the high ceilings. Sansa stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding with the finality of it all. She expected to feel triumph, but all she felt was a deep, tired relief. It was done. Joffrey was no longer king. The battered city stood on the brink of a new era. Daenerys turned to her. "You are Sansa Stark, the Wolf Queen, as they call you." Her eyes held curiosity. "Why did you help me take the city?" She hesitated, gathering her scattered thoughts. "I wanted to save as many lives as I could. And to end his cruelty." That was the simple truth, though it was layered in years of pain. Daenerys nodded. "You have suffered much. I intend to see the realm rebuilt. You may remain here, or return north if that is your wish." A pause. "The North remembers. They may welcome you as the last Stark." Sansa felt an ache in her chest at the mention of her homeland. "Winterfell is. I've dreamed of returning," she admitted. "But I also feel a duty to the people here." She glanced around at the massive hall. So many had died in the city. So many had lived in fear of Joffrey. "I don't know if I can simply leave them, not after everything." Daenerys studied her, a new respect in her gaze. "You have a choice. In my new Westeros, the people will be free to choose their own paths. The same goes for you." Sansa bowed her head, overcome by a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She realized that she did not need to decide that moment. The future was open, more open than it had been since the day she first set foot in King's Landing as a naive young girl. Tears spilled down her cheeks. This time, they weren't entirely tears of grief. In the days that followed, Joffrey was tried for his crimes before a council of lords loyal to Daenerys as well as delegates from across the realm. Tyrion Lannister, freed from any forced loyalty to the crown, testified about Joffrey's many atrocities. Others came forward with stories of horror. Sansa, too, spoke, her voice clear, detailing how her father was unjustly executed, how Joffrey's sadistic impulses had terrorized the realm. The verdict was swift. Joffrey was guilty. He was stripped of any royal title. A hush fell over the court as Daenerys pronounced his sentence. To Sansa's surprise, Daenerys elected to spare his life. "Let him be sent to the wall," she declared. "Let him serve in the Night's Watch if the Watch will have him. The realm needs no more unnecessary bloodshed." There were murmurs of disagreement, but Daenerys was firm. For her part, Sansa felt a surge of mixed emotions. Part of her wanted Joffrey dead to see him pay the ultimate price for all he had done. Another part remembered how each death led to more vengeance. Maybe it was time to break that cycle. Watching the once proud boy king led away in shackles toward the cold north, Sansa felt a strange sense of closure. Perhaps the gods would deal with him in their own time. Sansa faced her own reckoning. Her marriage to Joffrey was annulled by the new royal decree, given it was founded on false pretenses and overshadowed by his crimes. She was free. The shock of it settled in slowly, like the thaw after winter's most relentless storm. She chose to remain in King's Landing for a time, helping Daenerys and her advisors restore order. The city needed rebuilding. With her knowledge of the capital's workings and the grudging respect of the people, she could do some good. Daenerys accepted her counsel, forging a cautious alliance with the last living Stark daughter who had once been a Lannister prisoner. In the months that followed, Sansa worked tirelessly to see that the war orphans had shelter, that starving families received grain, that the streets were policed by fair-minded guards rather than bullies. Daenerys, for her part, introduced new reforms determined to break the cycle of tyranny. Tyrion became Daenerys's hand, a role he embraced with vigor. Together, they sought to unify a realm long fractured by bloodshed. Through it all, Sansa discovered a new wellspring of strength within herself. No longer a frightened girl, no longer a queen in name only, she stood on her own merits. She forged a future shaped by her own choices, not just the will of those who would use her. And in the eyes of many, she became a symbol of resilience, proof that even the most downtrodden can rise. Finally, when her work in the city was stable enough that she could bear to leave, she turned her thoughts north. She had heard that the remains of Winterfell were being rebuilt under the guidance of the surviving Northmen. It was time to see if her ancestral home could be reclaimed and if the Northern Lords would welcome her return. She informed Daenerys of her decision, and the Queen gave her blessing. Before she departed, Sansa walked the walls of King's Landing one last time, gazing out at the city that had once felt like a prison. The sun rose above the rooftops, illuminating the bay with golden light. Down below, people bustled in the streets, no longer cowering under the shadow of a boy king's whims. Soldiers in Targaryen colors stood guard at the gates, watchful but not cruel. Somewhere in the distance, the faint roar of a dragon reminded her that the realm had changed. She touched the stone of the parapet, recalling how she used to stand here, imagining her old home in the distance. Now she was free to travel north, to claim her heritage, to see if there was a future for House Stark. She felt a pang of sadness for all she had lost, her father, her mother, her brothers. But she carried them with her, in her heart. Their memory guided her steps. Sandor Clegane found her on the ramparts. He said nothing, simply looked at her with that half-burned face, an unreadable expression. "You're heading north," he finally said, more statement than question. She gave a small nod. "Yes." He grunted. "Then go. The real wolves are there." She smiled sadly. "What about you?" He shrugged. "City's got nothing for me. Might head out? The realm's big." For a moment, she considered asking him to come with her, but she sensed he needed to walk his own path. So she bowed her head and whispered, "Take care, Sandor." He said nothing in reply, only turned and walked away. And so Sansa Stark, no longer the naive girl, no longer the powerless wife, left King's Landing in a modest retinue, riding north along the King's Road. The sky felt wider than it had in years, the air fresher. Each day that passed took her further from the nightmares of the Red Keep. Along the journey, she sometimes awakened in the dark, startled by dreams of Joffrey's sneer. But then she'd look around and remember that she was free, that his reign was ended, that she had helped spare the city from yet another conflagration. She wasn't sure what she would find in Winterfell or if she could truly reclaim the seat of her ancestors. She only knew she had to try. She carried a quiet hope in her heart that the North would remember who she was and what she had done, and that some measure of justice would guide the realm. She had learned that justice was fragile, easily overshadowed by those with power. But she had also learned that hearts could change, that alliances could form in the unlikeliest places, that even a frightened girl could grow into a determined woman who shaped the fate of thousands. Upon crossing the neck, she felt the first real chill of northern wind. Her blood quickened. The road was flanked by pine forests, the skies gray and vast. Memories flooded her, Winterfell's courtyards, the godwood with its ancient heart tree, the laughter of her siblings in the corridors. Tears stung her eyes. She guided her horse onward, unwavering. One evening, as she set camp under the towering pines, she gazed at the stars glittering above. She realized that for the first time in so long, she felt a sense of peace. The war wasn't fully over, the realm would still face trials, and the North might hold its own challenges. But she was free of the monster who had haunted her every waking moment. She had survived. More than that, she had done what she could to save others from his cruelty. The weight of it all made her shoulders lighter. She slept that night without nightmares. In the morning, she rose and continued her journey. The North beckoned, and with it, a renewed purpose. She might never forget the horrors she had faced in King's Landing, but she would carry forward the lessons, the strength she had forged in the crucible of that marriage. She rode toward Winterfell with her head high, as her mother had taught her. And in the quiet hush of the northern woods, she heard a whisper, almost a chant on the wind, "The North remembers." She let a small smile curve her lips, pressing her hand to her heart. Yes, she thought, the North remembers. And so did she. Sansa Stark rode north with a heart full of memories and hopes. Each passing league carried her closer to the land she had once called home. There were moments during the journey when she felt an immense weight pressing upon her, as if the ghosts of her past trudged alongside. So many faces, her father's kind gray eyes, her mother's caring voice, Rob's gentle humor, haunted her dreams at night. By day, she tried to remain focused on the road, on the men and women traveling with her, on the faint light of a future that might yet be shaped by her own hands. A small party accompanied her. These were not knights in shining armor nor a grand retinue. Instead, she was guarded by loyal northerners who had come south in the final days of King's Landing's turmoil, along with a handful of city folk who believed that in traveling north with Sansa Stark, they might find safer fortunes. The banner they bore was the direwolf of House Stark, stitched hastily onto plain fabric. Many times along the road, travelers or villagers gawked at the sight of that direwolf banner, uncertain what to make of it. But none challenged Sansa's passage, not in the wake of a new Targaryen ascendancy and the collapse of Joffrey's cruel reign. The realm was weary of war and strife. And for that reason, the roads, though not entirely safe, were at least less beset by the usual chaos. Brigands still lurked, but Daenerys's new policies for more organized local watches had already somewhat improved security. Yet it was hardly a simple or comfortable journey. The wilderness north of the Trident was scattered with broken villages, burned-out farmsteads, and travelers who looked as though they'd lost everything. The War of the Five Kings had ravaged these lands more than once, and scars remained in every blackened beam, every hushed ruin. Sansa felt those scars echo in her own heart. Sometimes she paused to help, offering what small provisions her people could spare, handing out lumps of bread or coppers. She still saw worry flicker in the eyes of those who watched her. The Stark name might mean something, but it did not automatically banish hunger or fear. She pressed on with quiet determination. As the days lengthened, she began to see more pines and firs, taller and darker, the kind that thrived in the colder climate of the north. The wind developed a certain bite, a crispness that reminded her of Winterfell's courtyard in autumn. When the first genuine chill brushed against her cheeks, she closed her eyes and breathed in, letting the air fill her lungs. She could almost taste the memory of a gentle snowfall. These thoughts spurred her onward. Her traveling companions respected her silence on the road, for she was a woman carrying a great deal of sorrow and a great deal of purpose. At night around the campfire, they sometimes shared small stories of their own. One had lost her husband in a Lannister raid years ago, another had fled from a Frey garrison. Another had spent months living in the woods after his village was burned by Ironborn. Their stories wove a tapestry of hardship, but the fact that they were sharing these stories under a calm sky, unharried by soldiers, was itself a sign that the realm had begun to change. They reached Moat Cailin near dusk one day, its ancient towers looming out of the boggy terrain like broken teeth. Once that fortress had stood proud and formidable, the southernmost defense of the north. Now it was half-collapsed, dotted with stagnant pools of water. Still, a small group of sentries under the banner of the new Lady of the Neck, Mira Reed, daughter of Howland Reed, challenged Sansa's approach. The men on the causeway looked wary, but when they saw the Stark banner and realized who was among the travelers, they passed word swiftly. Sansa was greeted with courtesy and a measure of awe. The Reed's men offered them safe passage, stabling for their horses, and simple food. It was the first tangible confirmation that her name truly did mean something here. The men murmured Lady Sansa or Your Grace, though she had abandoned that title in King's Landing. She felt a flash of unease each time she heard it. To be queen to Joffrey had been a burden and imprisonment. She would rather be called Lady Stark or simply Sansa. Still, she thanked them for their hospitality. Word traveled fast. A day later, Mira Reed herself came skimming across the swamps in a small skiff, her green-brown cloak blending with the marsh. Sansa hadn't seen the girl in years, but she recognized Mira's keen eyes and lithe figure from brief glimpses back at Winterfell, though at that time she herself had been too wrapped up in her own illusions of a southern fairy tale. Now, when Mira bowed respectfully, Sansa gently took her hand and pulled her into an embrace. They were both changed, both older, both touched by war. Mira's voice was calm and clear. "Lady Sansa, it's an honor to welcome you home. My father was always loyal to House Stark." Sansa managed a small smile. "I'm grateful for that loyalty, Lady Mira. We've lost so much, but I hope we can begin to rebuild." They spoke in the tower that still stood, a half-ruined chamber but at least sheltered from the elements. Mira explained that the Crannogmen were doing what they could to keep the Neck safe from roving bandits or stray fry forces. She'd heard rumors that the Boltons, once Warden of the North after betraying Robb, had been decimated when House Bolton fell into internal conflict. But some Bolton men still prowled the outskirts. With the arrival of Daenerys in the south, the region's political lines were shifting. The Freys had lost face and power with the downfall of the Lannisters, and certain northern bannermen had begun to band together again, though quietly. All these swirling facts made Sansa's head spin, but also gave her a kernel of hope. The North was fractious, yet it was no longer fully under the grip of House Bolton or the Iron Throne's cruelty. Perhaps that meant her presence could help unify them. She spent 2 nights at Moat Cailin, resting in relative comfort. The damp chill of the tower was oddly welcome, reminding her of the simpler days at Winterfell, where the air was always a bit cold and the hearth had to be kept blazing. At dawn of the 3rd day, she and her party pressed on, crossing the causeway with Mira's small escort leading the way. Beyond the bogs, the land rose, the forests thickened, and the road became a winding path shadowed by tall pines. They traveled for another week, passing through villages where ragged people blinked in astonishment at the sight of Sansa and her retinue. Whispers spread, "A Stark has come home." Some of the more hopeful folk approached, offering small tokens of hospitality, dried fish, a bit of ale, even a few bushels of winter wheat. Sansa was touched by their gestures. At each village, she did what she could. She offered thanks, gave them coins or supplies from the pack horses if they had extra, and reassured them that she came not to conquer but to restore. When asked if she was truly here on behalf of the Iron Throne, or if she served Daenerys, she told them simply that Daenerys Targaryen was now the reigning queen in the south, but that Sansa's duty was to the north first. She also began hearing more about the fate of Winterfell. The castle, once sacked and burned, had partially been repaired by the Boltons when they tried to claim the seat. After Roose Bolton's murder, some said by his own bastard, Ramsay, others said by northern loyalists, a power struggle had left the place empty, battered, and haunted by rumors of Ramsay's atrocities. Some said the castle's walls still bore bloodstains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The inhabitants, mostly forced servants or frightened peasants, had fled when infighting among the Bolton loyalists erupted. Now, it was said, a skeleton crew of guards remained under some minor lord who tried to style himself caretaker. Sansa's heart clenched at the thought of her family's ancestral home desecrated by such cruelty. She recalled her father's unwavering sense of duty, her mother's firm presence, her siblings racing around the yard. All of that gone, reduced to hushed tales of a ruin that might never reclaim its old grandeur. Yet she refused to believe it was lost forever. If Winterfell was still standing, if its walls could be patched and its hearth relit, perhaps House Stark could begin anew. The final leg of her journey took her across the White Knife and over the familiar rolling tundra that signaled the approaches to Winterfell. The sky was overcast, a flat gray that stretched endlessly, and a biting wind howled. Sansa drew her cloak tighter around her shoulders, her breath puffing in the cold air. Despite the gloom, she felt a growing sense of anticipation. She could almost see the shape of the castle in the distance, though it was masked by low hills. She tried to imagine the courtyard again, the gatehouse, the thick walls of stone. When at last the party crested a rise and Winterfell came into full view, Sansa felt tears sting her eyes. Much of the outer wall was intact, but the towers showed signs of scorching and collapsed roofs. Sections of the curtain wall had been hastily rebuilt with mismatched stones. Yet the castle retained a certain dignity, even half-ruined. Standing under that vast northern sky, it was still Winterfell, and to Sansa it was still home. The group halted while a few of Mira's men rode ahead to announce Sansa's presence. She watched from a distance as the gate creaked open. A handful of soldiers in patched leathers emerged. Their banner was unclear. Some battered sigil that might have once been a flayed man, half torn away. They looked anxious, uncertain whether to greet or repel the strangers. In the end, they let Sansa's scouts approach without violence. Slowly, Sansa and her companions advanced. Her heart pounded as they neared the gatehouse. The men-at-arms on the ramparts stared down at them, more curious than hostile. Then, an older fellow in a patched cloak stepped forth inside the yard. His hair was mostly white, his face lined with old battle scars. He looked from the Stark banner to Sansa's face, and his eyes widened as if he truly recognized her. "You're Ned Stark's girl," he said in a trembling voice. "You survived." Sansa gave a careful nod, dismounting. "I am Sansa Stark," she answered, her voice carrying in the cold air. "Daughter of Lord Eddard Stark and Lady Catelyn Tully. I've returned for Winterfell." The silence that followed was eerie. For a moment, she feared they might try to bar her or claim the castle. But then the older man sank to one knee, bowing his head low. One by one, the others followed suit, kneeling in the snow. A hush lay over them. Sansa, unsettled by the display, looked around. She recognized no one personally, and yet here they were, deferring to her as if she were truly their liege lady. At last, the man lifted his gaze. "My name's Harold Moss," he said. "I fought for the Boltons because I had no choice. They forced me after they killed my lord. I regret what was done here." His voice wavered. "If you mean to take Winterfell, I'll not stand in your way. Too many died for false lords." Sansa let out a long breath. "You've kept the castle from falling into worse ruin. For that, I can be grateful. But I'll need your help if Winterfell is to be rebuilt." Harold bowed again, tears brimming in his eyes. "Aye, my lady, I will do whatever you ask. The rightful blood of Stark belongs here." He stepped aside, and as the gates opened wide, Sansa led her horse into the courtyard. The sight was both familiar and heartbreaking. The ancient cobblestones were strewn with debris, broken arrow shafts, bits of wood, scattered straw. The great keep's roof was patched in places with tarred planks, and one tower near the eastern side had collapsed entirely, leaving a jagged stump. The stables had partly burned, leaving only a few functioning stalls. Yet the hot springs were still there, steaming faintly in the cold air, lending a small sense of warmth amid the ruin. Sansa closed her eyes briefly, remembering how the hot springs once warmed the entire castle, how she and Arya would sometimes stand near the heated walls after coming in from the snow. Memories cascaded through her mind, her father in the yard, arms crossed as he watched Robb and Jon practice swordplay, her mother walking briskly toward the great hall to hear petitions. For a moment, she was a little girl again, longing for her family's embrace. Then she blinked and the harsh present returned. There was work to be done. She turned to her people, speaking in a measured voice. "We'll make camp in the courtyard tonight. Tomorrow, we'll clear out some of these broken timbers and see how many chambers can be salvaged. We must check the walls, the wells, the granaries. Winter may be mild or it may be harsh, but either way, we need to be prepared." The men and women who followed her nodded, looking to her for leadership. It was a strange role, but one she had grown into across her trials in King's Landing. Her father had once taught her about responsibility, about caring for the people in your charge. Those lessons came back to her now as she surveyed the battered stronghold. She might not have an army, but she had enough hands to begin the long labor of restoration. And she had the name Stark, which in the north still carried a resonance that could unite folk. They set up a modest camp that night. The old barracks had a functioning roof, so a number of her followers slept there. Sansa herself chose a corner of the great hall that remained structurally sound, though the windows were broken. She wanted to be within the castle walls, to reclaim them in some symbolic way. They rigged a small brazier for warmth, and she huddled under furs with a sleepless mind. The wind whispered through the cracks, carrying the scent of pine and old stone. She wondered if any of her siblings, Arya, Bran, Rickon, were still out there. She knew about Robb's fate, about her mother's. But the others had vanished into rumor. The thoughts circled in her mind until exhaustion pulled her into an uneasy doze. At first light, she was up, walking the castle grounds. Some of her party followed with notepads or mental checklists, marking which towers were unsalvageable, where the walls needed buttressing, and how they might stock the kitchens. It was overwhelming. But Sansa pressed on. She refused to let despair paralyze her. For every broken roof tile, she thought, we'll replace it. For every collapsed archway, we'll rebuild it. If the centuries-old roots of Winterfell's foundation had survived, perhaps they could thrive again. As she explored, she found the old library tower in ruins. That made her throat tighten. The library had been one of her favorite places as a child, even though she hadn't been quite the bookworm Bran was. She remembered the hush of those shelves, the smell of parchment. Now, the tower was partially collapsed, the upper floor gone. The books and scrolls were lost, burned, or scattered. The heartbreak of it pressed at her chest. So much knowledge, so many stories, gone. She moved on, forcing herself to keep going. The yard where Robb once practiced archery with Arya was littered with charred planks. She paused in the spot where they had stood, tears threatening, but she swallowed them. If she let herself crumble now, she'd never have the strength to continue. She must live for them, for the memories and the possibility of a better future. Harold Moss hovered nearby, eager to make amends in any way he could. He explained that the forces occupying Winterfell had mostly fled or died in skirmishes. A handful of men like himself stayed simply because there was nowhere else to go. They had tried to keep the place from total disrepair, but it was a losing battle with so few hands. Sansa thanked him for his efforts, letting him know that in her eyes, a forced alignment with the Boltons did not make him irredeemable. Everyone in this realm had been forced into terrible choices. She could offer mercy so long as he remained loyal now. She also discovered a handful of women and children living in the old servants' quarters, survivors who had hidden away when the Boltons turned vicious. They emerged cautiously, blinking at the daylight, uncertain whether this new Lady Stark would expel them. Sansa knelt to speak gently with them. She promised that, as far as she was concerned, they belonged at Winterfell if they wished to stay. She would provide what food she could, ask them to help with the rebuilding. They were free now. Some wept with relief. Others simply bowed their heads, too numb from tragedy to do much else. Within a fortnight, the castle came alive with small but meaningful activities. Fires crackled in a handful of hearths. The stables were cleared of rubble so the horses could be sheltered. The battered gates were repaired enough to keep out wolves and raiders. The courtyard was swept and salvageable planks were stacked for future use. Sansa directed groups of workers to different tasks each day. Though supplies were meager, they persisted. A few local farmers began arriving with produce or game in exchange for coin, heartened by the prospect that House Stark was back in Winterfell. Sansa used some of the gold she'd carried north from King's Landing to buy what they needed. Bit by bit, the ruin began its slow transformation into a place of possibility again. When she walked the corridors in the evening, she felt the presence of her father most strongly. Once, these halls had rung with laughter, the bustle of servants, the footsteps of her siblings, and the watchful eyes of her mother. Now they were empty, echoing with the ghosts of the past. But in the steady glow of lanterns, with the faint warmth of the hot springs pumping through the floors that hadn't collapsed, she felt the first stirrings of hope. They had a roof over their heads, a chance to restore the Stark seat. It was around this time that small groups of northern lords and knights began to arrive. News had spread that Sansa Stark had reclaimed Winterfell from the ashes, and curiosity or loyalty drew them. Some came humbly, seeking forgiveness for bending the knee to the Boltons. Others came boldly, proclaiming they had always supported the Starks in secret. Sansa greeted each with courtesy, measuring their sincerity as best she could. She was no longer the naive girl who believed every honeyed word. She listened carefully, asked questions, and took mental note of who seemed genuine. Lord Serwyn, battered by the war, arrived with a handful of men, offering his allegiance if Sansa would protect his lands from raiders. Lady Barbary Dustin sent an envoy, not quite trusting enough to come herself, but acknowledging that House Stark might rise again. Even a few Manderleys from White Harbor sent messages, though they were cautious about the political shape of the new realm under Daenerys Targaryen. If the Targaryens demanded fealty, how would that sit with the proud northern lords who had once declared independence under Robb Stark? In response, Sansa stated that Daenerys had extended the chance for the North to govern itself, provided there was peace. She did not speak for Daenerys, nor did she pretend the Iron Throne's influence was gone. She merely stated that her duty was first to rebuild Winterfell and protect the Northerners who had suffered so deeply under the past war. Anyone willing to help in that task would be welcomed. This cautious stance seemed to reassure many. They recognized Sansa's predicament, torn between southern politics and the North's desire for autonomy, and respected her for trying to thread that needle. As the months stretched on, a slow trickle of supplies, skilled laborers, and loyal men came to Winterfell, aiding in the reconstruction. It wasn't a flood of support, no single clarion call from every corner of the North, but it was enough to keep hope alive. Late autumn brought frosty nights, earlier sunsets, and the promise of real winter lurking around the corner. Sansa stood one day on the partially rebuilt battlements, gazing out over the trees that were losing their leaves in swirling flurries of gold and orange. She clutched her cloak around her shoulders, acutely aware that winter in the North was not just a season but a force. If they could not finish stockpiling enough supplies, the castle's inhabitants would suffer. "Lady Stark," said a voice behind her. She turned to see Meera Reed, who had come north with her. Meera had proven a steadfast ally, skilled in scouting and setting small snares for game in the nearby woods. Sansa smiled. "Lady Meera," she said, inclining her head. "What news?" Meera joined her at the parapet, her hair lightly dusted with frost. "I took a few of my best scouts near the last river, looking for signs of raiding parties or trouble. We found the remains of a small camp, bolts, scraps of cloth. Could be stray Bolton men or bandits. But they haven't made any move on the surrounding villages yet." Sansa nodded gravely. "We'll have to send a patrol to ensure they don't harass the small folk." "Yes," Meera agreed. On a brighter note, the farmers around the Hornwood lands have begun replanting. They say the fields might yield a small crop next spring, if the winter isn't too harsh. "That's something at least," Sansa said, exhaling. Then she cast her gaze to the horizon. "I worry about the approaching cold. We need more stores, more firewood. And if bandits roam the forests, we must keep them at bay." Meera's expression was firm. "We'll handle it, one step at a time." Sansa looked at the younger woman, gratitude welling in her. They had grown closer in these past weeks, bound by the shared burden of trying to restore order. She recalled how timid and distant she'd felt as a girl, and how Meera had always seemed bold, resourceful. Life had pushed them in different directions, yet here they were, forging a bond of mutual respect. With a final nod, Meera turned to descend the battlements, leaving Sansa alone to watch as the distant sun slanted across the land. She stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cold air, listening to the silence of the North. It was only later that day when a different kind of news arrived, word from the south. A raven bearing Daenerys Targaryen's seal fluttered into Winterfell, guided by the old rookery that Sansa's people were gradually repairing. The parchment bore a message from Tyrion Lannister, now Hand of the Queen. He inquired about the North State, about Sansa's progress, and expressed Daenerys's official stance that she recognized the North's unique traditions. The new monarchy in King's Landing was busy consolidating alliances. Tyrion hinted that if Sansa truly wished, she could negotiate certain terms of semi-independence, though Daenerys would want the North to remain at least nominally under her rule, if only to maintain the peace of the Seven Kingdoms. Reading that letter, Sansa felt a swirl of emotions. On one hand, the idea of the North being free from southern entanglements was attractive, and she knew many northern lords would clamor for it. On the other hand, she had seen the city of King's Landing and how it was spared from total destruction. Daenerys had shown mercy. She was not the Mad King reborn. Perhaps a tenuous alliance could be beneficial, ensuring trade routes and mutual defense. In the uncertain times ahead, especially with so many scars left by war, the North might need allies. She penned a careful reply to Tyrion, thanking him for Daenerys's willingness to consider the North's perspective. She wrote that she was focused primarily on rebuilding Winterfell and ensuring the survival of her people through the coming winter. She did not commit to a formal stance on independence, but nor did she pledge unwavering fealty. She wanted to see how the realm settled under Daenerys's rule. If the new queen proved just and stable, the North could find a path to cooperation. That letter weighed on her mind for days. She remembered Tyrion's occasional kindness to her in King's Landing, how he had sympathized with her plight under Joffrey's brutality. She wondered if she might one day speak to him again in person, perhaps in more congenial circumstances. For now, she had to focus on the immediate tasks before her. Winter settled upon the land, gentler than some years, fiercer than others, but always cold enough to test one's endurance. Snow blanketed the castle's courtyards and turned the farmland outside the walls into an expanse of white. The nights grew very long. At dawn, workers huddled in thick cloaks and mittens, clearing paths, tending the animals. Inside the halls, the hearths burned continuously, fed by the stash of firewood gathered over autumn. Sansa's time was split between administrating these daily logistics, hearing the concerns of villagers who sought shelter, and trying to plan for the future. She found a measure of solace in routine. She rose before first light, often to help distribute tasks. She consulted with Harold Moss and Mira Reed on security matters. She met with the small council she'd formed, a half-dozen trusted individuals who oversaw stores, building repairs, diplomacy with neighboring lords. Though the old Great Hall was still partly damaged, they used a smaller side chamber for their gatherings. By candlelight, they discussed everything from farmland allocation to dealing with roving wolves. Some days were exhausting, and Sansa felt the ache of responsibility pressing down. Yet each night, before she retired to her simple bed in a partially rebuilt tower room, she remembered the terror of her days with Joffrey, the helplessness she had felt, and how far she had come. This was not an easy life, but it was hers to shape. Occasionally ravens arrived bearing letters from other corners of Westeros. The Lords of the Vale, led by Lord Robin Arryn and Peter Baelish, made cautious overtures, hinting they might offer assistance if certain marriages or alliances were arranged. Sansa felt an old coil of unease at the mention of Peter Baelish, who had once manipulated events around her so skillfully. She responded politely but noncommittally, refusing to let Baelish's cunning ensnare her again. The most unexpected letter came from the Citadel in Old Town, from a newly minted maester who had arrived there after escaping the war's devastation. His letter was full of scholarly inquiries about the state of the North, about Winterfell's reconstruction. He mentioned the return of a certain Bran Stark, rumored to have become something of a mystic beyond the wall. Sansa read the passage twice, her heart hammering. Bran was alive? She had heard fleeting rumors, talk of a boy with strange powers wandering beyond the wall, the new three-eyed raven. Could that be Bran? Or was it just another rumor among the thousands that circulated in these tumultuous times? She felt a deep longing. If Bran was truly alive, then she was not the last Stark. Perhaps there was still more of her family in the world than she realized. The letter provided no firm proof, just speculation. Still, it gave her a kernel of hope. She clung to it, reading and rereading that small paragraph. If the old gods willed it, maybe she would see her brother again. As winter drew on, the castle endured. Food stores ran low at times, but the hunting parties and the new trade routes that opened under Daenerys's rule allowed some supplies to trickle up from the south. The harbor at White Harbor occasionally sent shipments along the roads, though it was slow going through the snow. Sansa thanked the Manderleys for their efforts with formal letters, promising that once the land thawed, they would begin forging stronger ties for mutual benefit. One cold afternoon, she walked the ramparts alone, gazing across the snowy fields. Flurries drifted in the air, and the world seemed hushed. She could hear the distant caw of ravens from the rookery. As her eyes roamed across the white expanse, she thought she saw a figure trudging toward the gates. A cloaked traveler, moving slowly, half-limping in the drifts. She leaned forward, heart pounding. Who would be traveling alone in such conditions? She signaled to the guards. Within minutes, the gates were opened and the traveler stumbled inside, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. Sansa hurried down into the courtyard, gathering her skirts. She arrived to see the figure, a woman she realized tall, with a dirt-streaked face beneath a hood. Her hair was short, as if roughly cut, and her eyes were fierce but ringed with fatigue. She carried a sword at her hip and had a leather satchel slung over her shoulder. "Gods," Sansa whispered, stepping closer, her gloved hand reaching out. "Arya?" Her sister, her wild, missing sister, looked up, blinking snowflakes from her lashes. The lines of her face were sharper, older, but Sansa recognized the shape of those gray eyes, the set of her chin. For a moment, neither moved. Then Arya took a shaky breath. "Sansa!" They collided in a rough embrace. Sansa felt Arya trembling in her arms, and she herself was shaking, tears spilling freely. They clutched each other through the layers of cloak and fur, heedless of the watching guards. For so long, Sansa had believed she might never see Arya again. The baby sister who once scorned needlework and idolized swords. Who had always been so different, so determined. When they finally parted, Sansa guided Arya inside, summoning hot soup and a warm seat by the nearest hearth. Arya's voice was hoarse, but her smile, though faint, was genuine. "I heard rumors you had returned, that Winterfell was under Stark rule again. I had to come see for myself." Sansa gestured for the servants to bring more blankets. I thought you were… Well, I heard so many conflicting stories. But you're alive. How did you survive? A flicker of shadows passed over Arya's face. It's a long story. I ended up in Bravos for a time, training at the House of Black and White. I saw the aftermath of war across the narrow sea. I returned to Westeros and wandered, dealing justice where I could. When I finally heard about you, about your escape from King's Landing and your fight to reclaim Winterfell, I knew I had to come. Sansa swallowed, trying to piece together the image of Arya as a solitary wanderer, hardened by distant lands. She reached for Arya's hand. I can't believe you're here. I've dreamed of this day, but never thought. She trailed off, her eyes filling again with tears. Arya squeezed her fingers. There was a haunted look in her eyes, but also a flash of the old rebellious spirit. We Stark survive, she said softly. You more than anyone. They spent the rest of the evening together, speaking in hushed tones by the fire. Arya recounted fragments of her journey, how she escaped Harrenhal, how she survived the Riverlands incognito, how she eventually made her way to Bravos. She did not go into the darkest details of her time with the Faceless Men, but Sansa sensed a deep well of trauma there. Arya had changed. She was no longer a wide-eyed child, but a young woman who had seen the worst of the world and learned to adapt. Yet in her presence, Sansa felt the old bond of sisterhood stirring. They were two battered leaves from the same tree, finding each other in the wind-blown chaos. In turn, Sansa told Arya about King's Landing, about Joffrey's cruelties, about how she had finally turned against him to save the city from Dragonfire, and how she made her way home. She spoke of the heartbreak of their family's fate. The Red Wedding, the rumors of Bran's survival. They sat there, shoulders pressed together, exchanging stories in subdued voices, forging a fragile sense of comfort in the knowledge that they were not alone. The hours slipped by until the hearth's embers glowed low and exhaustion pulled at their eyelids. In the days that followed, Arya tried to adjust to life at Winterfell. She was restless, unaccustomed to the routines of a keep. Often Sansa found her outside, practicing sword forms in the courtyard or hunting in the woods with Mira Reed. But Arya also recognized the necessity of what Sansa was doing, governing, rebuilding. Sometimes after supper, Arya would slip into the seat next to Sansa and ask about the day's council. She would frown at the mention of petty disputes, but she listened as if trying to understand the shape of leadership. You've changed, she told Sansa one evening as they took a quiet walk along the snowy battlements. The night sky was clear, stars burning overhead. You're stronger. More sure of yourself. Sansa glanced at her, breath misting. It didn't come easily. And you're so skilled now. I saw you with that blade you carry. Arya touched the hilt of her sword. Needle, she said with a small, fond smile. Jon gave it to me once upon a time. I've learned much since then. But we're still Starks, aren't we? Sansa nodded, her eyes drifting over the snowy fields. We are. We survived. Their conversation lingered on the memory of Jon. They wondered where he was if he still lived. The last they knew, he had joined the Night's Watch, become Lord Commander. Rumor said he died in a mutiny, then some said he lived again. It was all so tangled that Sansa dared not believe any single tale. But Arya's return had rekindled hope. Perhaps all was not lost, and maybe, in time, fate would bring more of them together. As the winter deepened, more houses sent word acknowledging the Starks' return. With Arya by her side, Sansa felt more confident in her negotiations. The winds of the north had shifted, and the houses who once feared the Boltons began aligning openly with House Stark. The Karstarks, led by a distant cousin of their old line, tentatively pledged support. The Umbers, fractured after the death of Great Jon Umber, seemed uncertain, but a portion of their household declared loyalty to Winterfell. In these uncertain alliances, Sansa trod carefully. She did not want a new war, she wanted stability. So she offered respect and mercy, forging bonds through shared hardships rather than vengeance. Arya, more pragmatic, grumbled that those who betrayed House Stark should pay a price, but Sansa insisted that the realm had seen enough blood. If they wanted House Stark to endure, they needed to show they could lead justly. Still, Sansa could not ignore the possibility that some lords might resent or even plot against her. She took precautions. A small guard contingent was maintained at Winterfell, men she trusted. She consulted with Mira, who kept scouting parties active. And she quietly ensured that if any trouble brewed, ravens would fly to Daenerys' forces in the south asking for support. She had no illusions that an army of Unsullied or Dothraki would ride up to save her on a whim, but the threat alone might deter some ill-advised rebellion. Amid these political maneuvers, the personal bond between Sansa and Arya grew stronger. They bickered sometimes. Arya teased Sansa for her meticulous courtesy, Sansa scolded Arya for her impulsiveness, but beneath it lay an undercurrent of fierce love. Even an argument felt like a gift after all the years they had been apart. One day, after a raucous dispute about whether to let certain men from the Dread Fort serve in Winterfell's garrison, they ended up laughing together in the library ruins, the tension melting away. Winter nights were long, and the castle's main hall was still too damaged for grand feasts, but they managed smaller gatherings in the refurbished wing near the kitchens. The smell of stewed meat and fresh bread sometimes filled the corridors, a sign of slow but real revival. Servants and lesser courtiers told stories, sang songs, and even danced a little when the mood was bright enough. Arya watched these scenes with a mixture of curiosity and faint longing. Sansa wondered if her sister would ever truly feel comfortable within walls again, given all she had been through. But she did not push. She let Arya find her own way. When the last snows of winter began to recede, it came as a relief. The nights were still cold, but the days grew a fraction longer, and the promise of spring lurked in the air. Sansa walked the muddy courtyard one morning, picking her way past patches of slush. She saw new buds on the winter roses that clung to a sheltered corner. The first sign of life returning to the north. That very afternoon, a band of riders appeared on the road bearing a surprising banner, the Targaryen sigil, the three-headed dragon, along with the direwolf of House Stark. Sansa and Arya stood at the gates as the visitors approached, a mix of northern men and a few southern knights, leading a covered wagon. Riding at their head was a figure swathed in a thick cloak with the Targaryen colors. When they drew closer, Sansa recognized her, Missandei, Daenerys' trusted advisor, the elegant woman from Noth. She dismounted gracefully, smiling with genuine warmth. "Lady Sansa, Lady Arya," she said, bowing her head. "I bring greetings from Queen Daenerys." Sansa and Arya exchanged a look of surprise. They had not expected a personal envoy from the queen so soon. They welcomed Missandei and her escort into the castle, offering hot meals and a place to warm themselves. In the newly refurbished solar, they gathered around a small table. Missandei set down a carefully sealed letter. "This is from Her Grace," Missandei said, nodding to Sansa. "She has heard of your progress in rebuilding Winterfell and of the North's uncertain stance regarding the crown. She wishes to open negotiations in earnest, perhaps even invite you to King's Landing to discuss terms." Her gaze flicked to Arya. "You as well, Lady Arya, if you so choose." Arya's brow furrowed. "Another trip south?" Sansa exhaled, recalling the stifling heat of King's Landing, the intrigues that once trapped her. But this time would be different. She was no longer Joffrey's prisoner. If she chose to go, it would be as Lady Stark with her own power. Still, she was wary. "We appreciate the Queen's invitation," she said carefully. "But the North has only just begun to heal. Traveling south might be ill-timed unless we're sure it benefits our people." Missandei inclined her head. "I understand. The Queen does not demand, she requests. She believes a united Westeros would be stronger, especially if any threats remain from beyond the wall or across the seas." Arya's expression grew guarded. "Daenerys has her dragons. Is that a threat or an offer of alliance?" Missandei's eyes flicked between them. "An offer of alliance. She respects your autonomy but hopes we can find common ground. The realm has bled enough." She paused, then added softly, "I have seen your city, Lady Sansa, in the aftermath of Joffrey's reign. I know what it is to live under cruel masters. Daenerys is not that. She wants to break the wheel that has ground so many beneath it." Sansa remembered the day the city's gates opened to Daenerys' forces. The relief she felt when the dragons did not burn everything. She nodded slowly. "I will read her letter, and we will give it due consideration." Missandei smiled. "Thank you." Then she gestured to the wagon her escort had brought. "We also brought some supplies, grain, healing salves, cloth, courtesy of the crown." A gesture of goodwill. Sansa's breath caught. That was a much-needed bounty. "That's quite generous. Thank you." She felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, gratitude, caution, hope. "Please, let your men rest here for a few days while we sort through the details." Missandei agreed. Over the following days, Sansa and Arya pored over Daenerys' letter in private. It was written in careful, regal prose, praising House Stark's resilience, acknowledging the horrors inflicted upon them, and expressing a desire for lasting peace. Daenerys proposed that the North could be granted broad freedoms, self-governance in most matters, minimal tribute, provided they recognized her as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. In return, Daenerys would aid in the North's defense if needed and trade routes would remain open. Arya read the letter over Sansa's shoulder, frowning. She sounds sincere, Arya muttered. But how do we know this will last? How do we know she won't become another tyrant in a decade's time? Sansa sighed. We don't. But maybe we can ensure terms that protect the North. And if she truly wants peace. She thought of the people living under Winterfell's partial roofs, how they needed stable trade to rebuild properly. If we remain isolated, we might weaken ourselves for any new threat that arises. Arya gazed at her. You've really taken to this leadership role. Sansa set the parchment aside. I've learned enough to know that shutting out the entire world can be dangerous. Father always valued loyalty and honesty. If Daenerys can uphold her end, we should at least consider it. After much deliberation, Sansa decided to travel south, but only halfway, to meet Daenerys in a neutral location. She proposed White Harbor as a meeting point or possibly the Crossroads Inn in the Riverlands, depending on which was more feasible. This way, Winterfell would not be left without leadership for too long, and Sansa would not subject herself to the labyrinth of King's Landing unless she felt it truly safe. Arya volunteered to accompany her, though she loathed the idea of returning anywhere near the south. I won't let you go alone, Arya said firmly. Missandei relayed the proposal via Raven, and within a fortnight an agreement came back that Daenerys would travel by ship to White Harbor to meet Lady Sansa Stark and discuss formal terms. Sansa felt a tremor of anxiety at the notion of hosting a queen with dragons. But she reminded herself that she was not a frightened child anymore. She was a Stark of Winterfell, and the North had endured worse. Preparations began. Sansa gathered a modest entourage, a handful of guards, some skilled negotiators from among the northern lords who had aligned with her, Mira Reed for her keen insight, and of course, Arya. She left behind a small council to oversee Winterfell in her absence. Though the roads were still muddy with melting snow, they set out when the first real thaw arrived, traveling east to the White Knife and then downriver. The journey was long, but not as perilous as it might have been in previous winters. Word had spread that House Stark was reuniting with the Crown, and potential bandits mostly kept their distance. White Harbor loomed before them, eventually tall walls, bustling docks, the swirling waters of the Bight. The merman sigil of House Manderly flew from the ramparts. Within the harbor, Sansa could see foreign ships with black sails bearing the Targaryen dragon. A flicker of awe moved through her. She had seen Daenerys's might in King's Landing, but there was something imposing about seeing her ships anchored in a northern port. Wyman Manderly had died some time ago, replaced by his son, Wylis Manderly, who greeted Sansa at the gates with elaborate courtesy. Lady Stark, he said, bowing low. It is an honor to welcome you. My father spoke often of your family's hospitality in years past. We hope to repay it now. Lord Wylis, she said with a gracious nod. We're grateful for your welcome. And for hosting this meeting. He escorted them into the city. White Harbor was a stark contrast to King's Landing, cleaner, whiter stone. The architecture reflecting a blend of northern fortitude and maritime influence. The Manderlys prided themselves on culture, often adopting southern customs, but they remained loyal to the north. Sansa noticed that the people in the streets seemed curious but not fearful. Perhaps they sensed that this alliance could bring prosperity. Daenerys Targaryen arrived the following morning in a small procession. She rode in a carriage, accompanied by a retinue of unsullied on foot, as well as a few mounted knights. Tyrion Lannister was among them, scanning the surroundings with sharp eyes. The moment Sansa saw him, she felt a pang of recognition. He had once been her husband in a bizarre, forced arrangement. Yet of all the Lannisters, he had been the least cruel, the one who had shown her kindness. The meeting took place in the main hall of Newcastle, the Manderly's seat. Sansa stood with Arya at her side. On Sansa's other side were a few northern representatives, among them Lord Serwyn and Lady Alice of House Karstark. Daenerys entered with Tyrion, Missandei, and Grey Worm. Sansa observed Daenerys carefully. The Targaryen queen was slight of stature, yet radiated an undeniable authority. Her silver-white hair and regal bearing lent her an almost ethereal aura. But her expression was neither haughty nor cruel. She looked at Sansa with keen interest. So we finally meet under more peaceful circumstances, Daenerys said, her voice carrying in the hall. Lady Sansa Stark, I have heard of your trials in King's Landing and your courage in reclaiming your home. Sansa dipped her head, mindful to keep her tone measured. Your Grace, We have both survived terrible conflicts. I hope we can now shape a better future." Daenerys inclined her head in return. "That is my wish. Please call me Daenerys if you like. I do not stand on ceremony as firmly as some." Sansa allowed a small smile. "Then you may call me Sansa." Arya looked between them, arms folded, saying nothing yet. Her face was guarded, as if she expected betrayal at any moment. Tyrion, for his part, cast Sansa a subtle nod of greeting, which she returned. Missandei stepped forward to facilitate introductions, then directed them to a long table set with light refreshments. The next few hours were a delicate dance of conversation. Daenerys asked about the North's condition, its rebuilding efforts, the needs of its people. Sansa replied candidly about the challenges they faced: damaged farmland, the lingering threat of bandits, the precarious alliances among the northern houses. She also pointed out that the North had weathered much worse than war alone. The harsh climate, the threat of White Walkers once, though that threat had waned since the destruction of the Night King. But some rumors still circulated that not all the undead had vanished. Daenerys listened closely, occasionally glancing to Tyrion, who scribbled notes. Then she spoke of her own vision, a united Westeros, free of tyranny, where each region maintained its identity but acknowledged a single crown to prevent endless wars. She described how she had ended slavery in Essos, how she had broken the power of the old families who hoarded wealth and oppressed the common folk. "I wish to do the same here," she said softly, "not by fire and blood, but by forging alliances that bring prosperity to all." Sansa weighed these words. She remembered how Daenerys could have burned King's Landing yet stayed her hand, at least mostly, unlike her father's father, the Mad King. Still, the Targaryens had a history of conquest. "Your intentions seem just," Sansa admitted, "but I must consider how to secure the North's right to self-rule in many matters. We do not want another southern king or queen meddling in our laws, especially those tied to our traditions and the old gods." Daenerys nodded thoughtfully. "I do not wish to trample the customs of the North. My aim is to ensure that no realm breaks away entirely, sowing chaos. We are stronger together, but I am open to broad autonomy for the North." Arya broke in, tone clipped, "And if the North decides it wants complete independence?" A hush fell. Daenerys's violet eyes flicked to Arya. "I understand that desire. I once sought to reclaim my own family's independence in a sense after exile. But now that I see Westeros in its entirety, I believe fracturing the realm further only invites new conflicts. Outside threats, like Euron Greyjoy once was, or the remains of the Golden Company, could exploit our divisions." Arya's expression hardened, but Sansa placed a hand on her arm to calm her. "We cannot forget how isolation cost us dearly in the past," Sansa said. "Our father went south to serve the realm and lost his life. But that was under a different regime. Perhaps a new arrangement could avoid such tragedy." They continued in this vein, discussing trade, the potential for cross-realm roads, port tariffs, and the responsibilities each party would hold. It was as much a conversation about the future shape of Westeros as it was about the North's immediate concerns. Tyrion, ever the diplomat, suggested they formalize an agreement stating that the North would remain a recognized part of the Seven Kingdoms, but that House Stark, or its appointed representative, would hold full authority over northern affairs, with minimal tribute to the crown, symbolic rather than burdensome. Daenerys would station a small envoy in White Harbor to facilitate trade and communication, but not an occupying force. This arrangement could be reviewed in 5 or 10 years, ensuring it was beneficial to both sides. Sansa was cautious yet intrigued. A symbolic fealty might be enough to placate southern lords who feared the realm's disintegration while ensuring the North governed itself. She wanted to consult the northern lords who had joined her. She excused herself to speak privately with them. Arya came along, her expression stormy. In a side chamber, Sansa turned to Lord Serwyn and Lady Alice Karstark. "What do you think?" she asked them quietly. Alice Karstark pursed her lips. "There's an appeal in forging peace. We've seen enough war. If the Targaryen queen keeps her word, this deal could bring prosperity, and we have so few resources right now." Lord Serwyn agreed. "We might not stand against the dragons if it came to open conflict. Better to negotiate terms while she is being generous." Arya's voice was tight. "And if we sign away our freedom only to find ourselves under the dragon's claws later?" Sansa exhaled. "I won't pretend there's no risk. But the alternative might be constant skirmishes, no southern trade, and the fear that Daenerys or her successors could come north with fire if we break away." This negotiation might give us the best chance to safeguard the North's identity without more bloodshed. Serwyn nodded. I trust your wisdom, Lady Stark. Arya looked at Sansa, searching her face. After a long pause, she sighed. If this is truly the best path for our people, I'll stand by you. But I'll keep my eyes open. They returned to the main hall. Sansa explained that the Northern Lords were amenable to the proposed arrangement provided all details were clearly stated in writing and that Daenerys pledged a binding oath to respect Northern sovereignty. Daenerys seemed relieved, though still dignified. I will swear such an oath, she said. And I expect the North's pledged loyalty in return if the realm is threatened. They shook hands on it, Sansa's gloved hand meeting Daenerys's cool fingers. A wave of quiet relief spread through the gathered representatives. It felt like a momentous occasion, forging a new bond between the Targaryens and the Starks. Sansa wondered if her father, from the afterlife, would see this and feel some measure of contentment that the realm might finally find peace. The official signing took place the next day. A document was drawn up, carefully written by Tyrion and Missandei, then read aloud before the assembled lords of White Harbor and a handful of Daenerys's knights. Sansa, representing House Stark, and Daenerys, representing the crown, each pressed their signet rings into the hot wax. The small crowd applauded politely. It was done. A feast followed, modest by southern standards but hearty by the North's. Tables groaned under smoked fish, roasted venison, and thick stews. Manderly minstrels played lively tunes. Sansa exchanged a few words with Daenerys in a more casual setting, discovering that beneath her queenly bearing, Daenerys carried her own scars and memories of exile. They found a small but genuine connection in having both been thrust into positions of leadership after unimaginable tragedies. Arya lingered at the edges, not entirely comfortable with the formalities, but she did speak briefly with Tyrion. Sansa watched from across the hall, wondering what her sister might be saying to the imp. Tyrion's face shifted from amusement to solemnity, and Arya's eyes were steely. Sansa imagined Arya was warning him that if the crown broke its word, the North would never forgive. She might also be asking questions about King's Landing, about their father's final days. Sansa could only guess. As the evening wore on, Sansa found herself in a rare moment of calm, sipping a cup of mulled wine near a window that overlooked the harbor. The moon reflected on the dark water. The bustling feast sounds drifted in the background. She felt something in her chest loosen, a tension that she had carried for years. Peace, however fragile, seemed within reach. The North had a future that might not be marred by endless wars. She had reclaimed Winterfell with Arya's help, forging alliances instead of annihilating foes. It wasn't a perfect world, she still mourned her father, mother, Robb, the countless others lost. But the sense of an endless nightmare had lifted. Tyrion approached quietly, holding a goblet of wine. A far cry from the King's Landing feasts, isn't it? He said lightly. Sansa turned, offering him a gentle smile. Yes, it is. And I prefer it this way. Less pretense, less cruelty. He nodded. I never liked the Lion's Den either. But it seems we've both found new roads. They stood in companionable silence for a moment. Sansa recalled the time they had been forced to wed. He had tried to show her kindness when no one else would. She decided it was time to acknowledge that. Thank you, she said quietly. He tilted his head. For what? For being kind to me back then. It might have been small gestures, but it mattered. His mouth tightened. I only wish I could have done more to spare you Joffrey's wrath. But I was powerless in many ways. Still, she said, you were the only Lannister who showed any empathy. Now I'm glad to see you in a place where your talents can be used for better ends. He inclined his head. I appreciate that. Serving Daenerys feels more meaningful than serving my father ever did. They sipped their drinks, letting the chatter of the hall swirl around them. Then Tyrion spoke in a low tone. You've become quite a leader yourself. From what I hear, the people of Winterfell trust you. They say you're fair but not a fool, that you weigh mercy and necessity in equal measure. She glanced at him, surprised by the warmth in his voice. I've had many teachers, good and bad, she said, and I've paid dearly for every lesson. He let out a quiet sigh. So have we all. But some never learn. They parted on that note, each returning to their respective circles. The evening wound down, the final negotiations hammered out, and Sansa retired to a comfortable chamber provided by the Manderleys. Before slipping into sleep, she felt a cautious optimism. Perhaps this truly was the start of a new era, one where the North would heal rather than bleed again. The next morning, Daenerys departed White Harbor to return to her fleet, satisfied that the agreement was reached. She offered parting words of mutual respect and an invitation for Sansa and Arya, if she wished, to visit King's Landing at some point. Sansa kept the possibility open, though she did not commit. She wanted to see how the realm settled. Arya was relieved to stay far from the capital. They remained at White Harbor a few more days to rest and gather fresh supplies, then prepared to head back to Winterfell. As they readied their horses in the courtyard, Sansa took in the crisp northern air, her breath forming plumes in the morning chill. Lord Wylis Manderly came to bid them farewell, promising to support Winterfell's renewal efforts. Sansa thanked him warmly, reflecting on how House Manderly had always been a loyal pillar to the Starks, even through the darkest times. The journey home was smoother than the journey out. The roads were clearing, the snow melting in patches, revealing earthy ground. Villages they passed showed signs of slow revival. People recognized the Stark banner, some waving or calling blessings. Sansa and Arya led the column side by side, their sisterly bond a quiet anchor amid the swirl of events. They arrived at Winterfell under a bright midday sun that glinted off the castle walls. Though it was still battered, the keep looked a bit sturdier than when they had left. Workers had used the brief spring thaw to continue repairs. A new section of the roof had been laid, the courtyard was tidier, and some scaffolding rose along the tower that had once collapsed. It felt like stepping into a living place, not just a ruin haunted by the past. Sansa dismounted, handing her reins to a waiting stable boy. Arya hopped off her horse, scanning the courtyard with a hawk-like gaze. Then, quite suddenly, a familiar figure emerged from within, Mira Reed, who rushed forward with a smile. "You're back. How did it go?" Sansa let out a breath, smiling. "We have a treaty. The North retains wide autonomy and Daenerys recognizes us as the rightful rulers of these lands." Mira's eyes lit. "That's good news. Maybe we can truly rebuild now without fear of another war." "That's the hope," Arya said simply, though her tone conveyed her usual guarded caution. They moved into the castle interior. A group of servants hurried forward with water and towels to wash off the dust of travel. Sansa noted more people bustling about than before, likely refugees who had come to find work under Stark rule. Many nodded respectfully or murmured greetings. It felt good to be home again if a half-ruined castle could be called a home. But Sansa realized that home was not so much a building as the bonds that connected them. Now that Arya was here, that she had the North's acceptance, that the Targaryen threat was tempered by an alliance, Winterfell felt more alive. She felt the stirring of pride and responsibility. That evening she convened with her small council to share the details of the new treaty. Some lords grumbled at the notion of giving even nominal fealty to a Targaryen queen, but others recognized the benefits. As they debated, Sansa guided the conversation firmly, reminding them that no good came from antagonizing a monarch with dragons, especially one who was offering a fair arrangement. By night's end, the majority supported her decision. They toasted to a new era for House Stark, a more diplomatic path. The months that followed confirmed that Daenerys held to her word. Trade opened up. Goods flowed north more steadily than ever before. White Harbor became a thriving port, funneling southern and even overseas wares to Winterfell. With these supplies, the castle's reconstruction accelerated. Strong timber from the Wolfswood was cut for new beams, stone was quarried to rebuild the shattered towers, and more laborers arrived to work in exchange for fair wages. The improvements were visible: the library tower, partially rebuilt, the great hall's roof fully restored, the main gate reinforced. Even the crypts were cleared of debris. In that time, Sansa's role shifted from merely a survivor to a proper lady of Winterfell. She held open court once a week, hearing petitions from farmers, merchants, and lesser lords. She negotiated disputes, presided over small trials for theft or trespassing, and organized relief for outlying hamlets struck by disease or famine. She often consulted Mira, Arya, and her other advisors, but ultimately the decisions rested with her. People whispered that she had her father's sense of justice, tempered by her mother's protective warmth. While she had once dreamed only of being a fairy tale queen, she found more fulfillment in the day-to-day responsibilities that made a tangible difference in her subjects' lives. Arya remained restless, though she tried to help where she could, especially in training younger guards in swordsmanship. She took a measure of pride in passing along fighting skills. Still, Sansa sensed that a part of Arya yearned for the open road or the occasional thrill of an adventure. Yet for now, Arya stayed, as if she recognized Winterfell needed her presence. When the next winter finally loosened its grip, the castle prepared for a modest harvest from the newly sown fields. The farmland was not fully recovered, but it was a start. More children could be heard laughing in the courtyard as families who'd once fled returned to rebuild their lives. Sansa passed them sometimes, remembering her own childhood, how she'd once run with a carefree spirit through these same halls. She prayed these children would know a better, safer future. Letters came from King's Landing occasionally, updating them on the realm's affairs. Daenerys's rule faced its own challenges: unrest in Dorne, the Iron Islands seeking more autonomy, remnants of Lannister loyalists stirring trouble. But so far, the realm did not descend into another war. It seemed that a fragile peace held, aided by Daenerys's balanced approach and Tyrion's diplomatic skill. Sansa wrote back politely, sending news of the North's progress, sometimes inquiring about policies that might benefit trade and strengthen mutual defense. It was an odd feeling having a cordial correspondence with a Targaryen queen, but it was far preferable to constant dread. Another letter arrived from Old Town, from the same maester who had hinted about Bran. This time, he reported hearing new rumors that a mysterious young man with knowledge of the old gods and green dreams had been spotted near the wall, performing small miracles. Sansa read the letter with trembling fingers. Could it truly be Bran? She discussed it with Arya, who frowned thoughtfully. If it is him, he might be heading here someday. Or maybe he's on some greater quest. Bran always was different. Sansa clutched the parchment. If he comes, we'll welcome him. If not, I'll keep searching for clues. She refused to give up the hope of seeing her brother again. As the seasons passed, the alliances that Sansa forged bore fruit. The northern houses that once fought each other under different banners now cooperated under the shared goal of restoring their lands. Conflicts still arose, old grudges were not so easily forgotten, but Sansa's firm yet fair hand, combined with the knowledge that the Targaryen monarchy would intervene if outright rebellion broke out, kept those grudges contained. The idea of working together for a stable north gradually took root. Sansa came to be regarded as the Lady of Winterfell in more than title. Minstrels began weaving small verses about the Wolf Queen who had broken free from the Lion's Den, who returned to bring a gentler rule to the north. The name Wolf Queen lingered, sometimes whispered with affection, sometimes with awe. Although she was not a queen in the formal sense, her oath to Daenerys prevented that claim. The people felt she embodied the spirit of the North, crowned in resilience and cunning. Despite the heavy tasks of governance, Sansa found moments of personal solace. She took occasional rides in the Wolfswood, accompanied by Arya or Mira, breathing in the pine-scented air, listening to the hush of the forest. She visited the crypts of Winterfell more than once, placing fresh flowers on the statues of her father, mother, and Robb, silently talking to them in her mind. She prayed at the heart tree, its red leaves rustling in the wind, and sometimes she thought she could feel the presence of the old gods or of her brother Bran, somewhere out there in the vast unknown. Every so often, she dreamed of a day when all the surviving Starks might stand in Winterfell's great hall together, a family reunited. She pictured Jon among them, whether he was truly gone or somewhere beyond the wall, she did not know. She pictured Bran, wise and distant, and Rickon, the little boy with a head of wild hair. Arya was there, and so was she, older and tempered by sorrow but still holding on to love. Perhaps that was only a dream. But she cherished it. Dreams had once been her undoing, but now she believed they could guide her to keep hoping for better things. As the summer finally reached full bloom, the north saw green fields, a pleasant respite from the endless cold. Crops rose in the farmland outside Winterfell, wagons rumbled along the roads, and the castle gained new life. One evening, a gathering took place in the great hall, still smaller than the grand feasts of old, but large enough for the lords and ladies who had come to mark the season's bounty. Torches flickered, casting warm light across tables laden with bread, cheese, roast boar, and fresh vegetables. Sansa presided at the high table, Arya beside her, Mira and the other council members nearby. The mood was convivial. Cups of ale and wine were raised in toasts, laughter echoed across the hall. Sansa felt a rare sense of contentment. She watched as children danced in a corner, as older men swapped tales of hunts and battles. The North had not been this lively in years. She recalled how once she had sat by Joffrey's side in King's Landing, forced to endure cruelty. Now she ruled with compassion among her own people in the seat of her ancestors. The difference was staggering. As the night wore on, Sansa stood, raising a hand for silence. The hall quieted. She spoke with a steady voice, shaped by the lessons of courtly courtesy but resonant with her own genuine conviction. She thanked everyone for their tireless efforts in rebuilding the castle and the surrounding lands. She praised the farmers for bringing in a decent harvest, the craftspeople for their labor, and the guards for keeping peace. We have come far from the ruin that once filled these walls, she said, her words echoing. Though we still have challenges ahead, I believe in the North. I believe in our resilience, our unity. As long as we stand together, no foe can truly break us. The crowd cheered, raising their cups. Arya smirked, offering her a sideways glance. Sansa knew her sister wasn't one for long speeches, but from the small nod Arya gave, she sensed approval. A musician struck up a tune on the lute, and the evening continued in high spirits. Later, when the revelers had begun to disperse and the hall emptied, Sansa lingered near the main doors, looking up at the vaulted ceiling. Arya approached, resting a hand on the hilt of needle. You did well, Arya said simply. Sansa turned to her, a tired smile tugging at her lips. I'm glad you think so. Sometimes I worry I'm not living up to Father's example. Arya made a quiet scoffing sound. No one's perfect. Father wasn't. But you're doing what needs to be done. The North is healing because of you. Sansa's eyes glistened. Thank you, Arya. They walked out into the courtyard, the sky dotted with stars, the air cool but not bitter. The hot springs still flowed under the ground, lending a subtle warmth to the stones. They paused by a low wall, gazing up at the moon. Arya spoke softly, as if confessing a secret. Sometimes I still think about leaving. There's a whole world out there. But I also think about how much I want to see Winterfell whole again. I spent so long dreaming about coming home. Now I'm here. Sansa reached for Arya's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Home isn't something you have to stay at forever. It's something you can carry with you so you know you're never alone. But I'm grateful you're here now. They stood in companionable silence, the night wrapping around them. Nearby, the sound of wind through pine branches mingled with the distant hush of the springs. Sansa inhaled, letting the sense of peace wash over her. For once in her life, she felt not the crushing weight of fear but the gentle burden of responsibility, a responsibility she had chosen to take up for the good of her people. From the vantage of the courtyard, Sansa could see the partial silhouette of the heart tree in the godswood, leaves rustling under the moonlight. She remembered nights at King's Landing when she'd stand on a balcony praying to the old gods she wasn't sure could hear her. Now she was home and maybe they could hear her after all. She closed her eyes, sending a silent prayer of thanks for the second chances life had granted, for the shards of her family that had pieced back together, for the alliances that had spared thousands more from death. She opened her eyes and let out a soft breath. Shall we go inside? Arya nodded and they turned away from the stars, heading back into the warmth of the castle halls. Beyond the walls of Winterfell lay an uncertain realm, a new Targaryen monarchy, and the potential for dangers yet unknown. But within these walls, for this moment, there was hope, sisterhood, and a future shaped by a Stark's gentle but unyielding hand. Time would unfold the rest of the story. The fate of Bran, wherever he might be, the final healing of the North from all its wounds, the evolution of Daenerys's reign. Yet no matter what came, Sansa knew she had found her place, her voice, and her courage. It was a far cry from the naive girl who once knelt before a cruel boy king, dreaming of courtly love. She was Sansa Stark of Winterfell now, a leader forged in pain, tempered by mercy, and guided by an unwavering will to protect those under her care. And so, under the silent watch of the northern sky, the Wolf Queen carried on. Step by step, day by day, breathing life back into Winterfell and ensuring that never again would a monster like Joffrey Baratheon hold her chains. She was free, and in her freedom, she offered a gentler rule to those who looked to her. Thus did the North remember, and thus did Sansa Stark write a new chapter in its ancient, ever-evolving tale.